Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to start this important workshop today. I understand from the registration number, we are around more than even 1,000 participants. I am extremely pleased to see such a level of attention in this very important and interesting topic. This audience from the public and academia, small medium enterprises is showing the interest, but also I think concern what will happen with clinical trials in 2022. An important milestone is only 63 days away. The applicability of the clinical trials regulation is the next important milestone in the history of this regulation. Personally, I was waiting for this moment for quite long. I remember when we started this project in 2010, basically proposing this to the Council and Parliament, and then negotiations, and we were able to get into agreement, and the text finally was published in 2014. And it's important marathon, and we'll conclude this in the next important milestone, which is 31st of January, when the new principles of clinical trials regulations and IT system go live, finally. The goal of clinical trials was to create an environment that stimulates establishment and undertaking of clinical trials in the European Union. We were asked to create robust, flexible, risk-proportional framework for high-quality trials with improved participation, collection of data, and transparency. The regulation is supposed to contribute to the support of higher number of clinical trials across Europe. In the end, this should lead to more innovation and faster access to European citizens to safe, high quality and efficacious innovative medicines. Authorization of clinical trials will substantially change compared to the way we do this today. There will be one single decision per member state involving national competent authority, and ethics committees will within strict timelines. Member states will need to cooperate in assessment of scientific documentation of multi-country trial application, and also in assessment of safety information originated from clinical trials participants. Next to the regulations, will make the EU important place to do the transparent clinical trials, but also facilitate enrollment in clinical trials, public scrutiny, and increase research efficiency. For this audience, it's also important to mention that clinical trials regulation recognizes the importance of non-commercial trials and contains provision for fee waivers by member states. Nevertheless, the scientific and ethical requirements for clinical trials will be done the same way for all types of sponsor. This is quite logical from a participant point of view. Until 31st of January 2023, you can still choose whether to submit your applications to start clinical trials according to the current system or according to the new clinical trials regulations. After that date, the use of the new system becomes mandatory. This is luxury. There is still time for preparation so that everyone can prepare and accustom the new rules in the new IT portal. I would like to thank you organizers who set up this important webinar, and I am delighted to see a broad panel of speakers from different organizations involved, academic, sponsors, SMEs, CRS, national competent authorities, EMA. this example of collaboration that we have enjoyed over recent years in the network. It is also collaboration which brought us to the finish line of this marathon. But new challenges are starting just now. We are working the network to make real success of the new legislation for clinical trials and put Europe even higher on the international map of medicines development. There's a lot more to come in next months. Thank you very much for your participation today. Wish you a very fruitful day. And I hope the learning curve will accelerate thanks to good preparation for this workshop, but also excellent speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andre. And maybe I can add my very warm welcome here from the EMA building in Amsterdam to today's SME and Academia webinar on the Clinical Trials Regulation and the Clinical Trials Information System. My name is Peter Arlett. I'm Head of Data Analytics and Methods at the EMA. And I think the event is very timely now that we have only 2 months left before the Clinical Trial Regulation becomes applicable and the Clinical Trials Information System goes live. We look forward to Europe moving into a new, harmonised and more collaborative way of working with clinical trials. We have participants registered to this webinar from SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, academia, regulatory authorities and stakeholder organisations. We also have participants following the event through the live broadcast. Today, colleagues will provide an overview of the main changes brought by the Clinical Trials Regulation. We will explain the new process for submitting clinical trials information in the EU, functionalities of the Clinical Trials Information System, Ctis, clinical data transparency, and new ways of reporting on safety in clinical trials. Guidance and training material available to sponsors will also be presented. We work hard to support sponsors in the implementation of the Clinical Trials Regulation, and this event is part of an extensive stakeholder engagement plan we've put in place in the last couple of years. I wish you a successful day, and I now wish to give the floor to Konstantinos Ziogas, Head of the SME Office at EMA. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. It's a real pleasure to see such a high level of attendance for our event today. And I would like to highlight that providing training and education is an essential part of EMA support to SMEs and academia. In 2020, we performed a survey to SMEs in the context of the 15-year anniversary of the SME regulation. And the survey highlighted the importance of promoting the SME and innovation agendas, increasing the training and education offered to small businesses and facilitating engagement with SMEs and their stakeholders. These are key themes in action today. Due to the current COVID-19 restrictions, we are holding this event virtually. The event is also broadcasted and recorded. You should have received the presentations in advance of the meeting, and the recording of the meeting will be published on the EMA website in the coming weeks. The program is divided in 5 sessions, including Q&As, and the presentations will be given by EMA, the European Commission, national competent authorities, companies, and academia. I really encourage you to actively engage in this event. You can raise questions in Slido, and you can use the code that we provided to you in advance of the meeting. We will not be able to address all questions in the Q&A sessions, but we would like to reassure you that they will be taken into account to fine-tune and develop further our guidance and training material. I already would like to thank all our colleagues from the EMA, the SME Office, Data Analytics Task Force, and the Academia Office for putting this great program together. And I would like to thank also all the presenters that have contributed to this event. And also a big thanks to the audiovisual team at EMA for all the support in organizing this meeting. Now, I will propose to move directly into session 1, which is titled An Overview of the Clinical Trials Regulation. And I will introduce Christophe Bonarens, who is a policy officer at DG Santé with the European Commission. And Christophe is an industrial pharmacist who started working for the Belgian National Agency back in 2005 and took the responsibility for the Research and Development Division, which was in charge of the clinical trials applications. Christophe was the Belgian member and secretary of the CTFGs, the Clinical Trial Facilitation Group, and the Belgian representative in the European Commission's Clinical Trial Expert Group. He was also part of the negotiations of the Clinical Trial Regulation back in 2013 and 14. After working in also in the Association of the Belgian Pharmaceutical Industry in 2016, he joined the European Commission in 2019. Christophe, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and good morning to all. It's an honor to talk to you all today and to give you a little bit of insight in the objectives, key changes, and transitional arrangements. So let's get to it. Next slide, please. First of all, the objectives and key changes of this new regulation. Next slide, please. This is something you will hear a lot today if you join for the whole session. The Clinical Trial Regulation 536/2014, in short, the CTR. We've adopted this legal text in April 2014 by European Parliament and published it in May 2014. The legislation had some modalities built into it to make sure that the IT part, European Portal and Database, would be fully functional at the time of applicability, which took a little bit longer than expected, but now we are there. We know that the date of applicability of the clinical trial regulation will be the 31st of January 2022. And 1 year later, on the 31st of January 2023, the legislation will oblige all sponsors to submit each new clinical trial application to be submitted and authorized under the CTR rules. There is some transition foreseen. I will talk and tell you more about this in a few minutes. There is a transition period as well for those trials ongoing, so those trials authorized already now. At the moment of applicability, 3 years later, all those trials will either need to be closed or will need to be transferred to the CTR regime. Next slide, please. So what is the purpose? What did the lawmaker have in mind when publishing this text, publishing the proposal, and finally agreeing to the compromise? Well, the underlying purpose was to make Europe competitive in research on medicinal products. There was already in 2014 a decline in clinical trials throughout Europe. There was a set of reasons and a set of causes of this, which the clinical trial regulation aims to fix. And it's the bullets here on this slide that are the main objectives, the main triggers, the main drivers to make that research situation in Europe better. First of all, the legislation puts down a harmonization of the approval process for clinical trials with a maximum timeline through a single electronic submission. So quite different to the current situation where there is several authorities in member states where there are maximum timelines, but only for national competent authorities, and where the submission rules differ from one country to the next. There is also in that legislation the obligation for close coordination within a member state and between member states when it's a multinational trial. There is an initiative to minimize the scope for regulatory autonomy at national level, coming back to that in a second. There is, of course, I would say, the underlying will to ensure that trial data that are produced under this new regime are reliable, are robust, and are of high quality. That goes without saying. All that with ensuring that the level of participant safety remains the same or even becomes better. And last but not least, one of the specific objectives of the new legislation was as well to increase transparency on the authorization and supervision of clinical trials. Next slide, please. I told you just now harmonization and the national level discrepancies. That's something the lawmaker really wanted to avoid. So that is clearly visible in the legal form. The existing legislation was a directive. That means that it has binding requirements, but they need to be implemented by each member state through national legislation, whereas now we have a regulation which is binding in its entirety, which is directly applicable to all member states and has no need for national legislation. I would even go further and say there is no possibility to make national legislation that puts additional rules on sponsors for clinical trial. That's an important concept. Next slide, please. So what are the main differences with the current legislation? I've put them all together in two slides. First of all, the scope remains limited to interventional research with medicinal products. So this means that this legislation, like the previous one, does not govern things like foodstuffs, cosmetics, and so forth and so on. It is applicable to medicinal products. However, all medicinal products are under its scope. So, for instance, advanced therapy medicinal products are covered by the scope of this legislation. The scope remains as it was, but there are some adapted definitions on clinical trial, non-interventional study, and low interventional trial. I'm explaining the latter one to you in a few seconds. Second new major difference is that there is now a streamlined submission and review process via the European Portal and Database, part of the Clinical Trial Information System, or Ctis. That system includes a tacit approval, which is identical for every EU and EEA member states. So it means a big step forward compared to the current situation where you need to submit to each European member state in a slightly different way. Third big major principle is that there's a single decision per member states, and that is quite different from the current system where you need an authorization from an NCA and an ethics committee. One decision per member state on the basis of that single submission I mentioned in the previous bullet. Assessment happens in a coordinated way through one reporting member state. Well, if it's a mononational trial, that reporting member state is that member state is the reporting member state. If there are more member states, it's up to the sponsor to propose and up to the member states concerned to be involved and to choose and to assess who will be the reporting member state. Each member state is duly concerned in the assessment process. Important to mention as well, I think, is that this legislation is without prejudice of other legislation. I've given two examples here, the GMO legislation, the radiopharmaceutical legislation. I can mention the legislation on substances of human origin as well. What does this mean? This means that this clinical trial regulation and the systems put in place to execute it only cover the aspects of clinical trials. GMO aspects, for instance, will need to go through different systems, will need to go to a separate track. Next slide, please. Another important aspect is that persons validating and assessing the application should be independent of the sponsor clinical trial site and so forth and so on. Important to know here, for those of you that know these definitions by heart, is that the investigator did not used to be in the clinical trial directive definition. It is there now. This is of particular interest for ethics committee organization in a member state, because in a lot of member states, the ethics committee is closely linked to the investigator's side. This is not longer possible under the clinical trial regulation. Some more bullets on the differences. There are strengthened rules on the protection of patients and informed consent. There is now a coordinated safety assessment through work sharing and streamlined safety reporting. So there is no more national reporting of SUSARs. There's no more national systems. Everything should go through a coordinated system. And as I said already, there is more transparency on the conduct and the results of the clinical trials. Last but not least, there is also the possibility for us as Commission to conduct union controls in member states and outside of the union to establish whether the national systems, whether the member state system are duly put in place to respect the principles of this legislation. Next slide, please. Just very quickly, I'm not going to go into detail. These are two new concepts that are, I think, important for academic research. First is the low intervention trial, basically some risk adaptations for products tested in clinical trials that have a marketing authorization or that are used on an evidence base. Co-sponsorship as well, important new concept, where a clinical trial can have more than one sponsor. A written contract needs to divide responsibilities between several sponsors. This is done as a way to guarantee that specific sponsors, notably academics, together with commercial organizations, can work together in a clear and straightforward way, also from a legal base. Next slide, please. A few words on the processes in the CTR. Next slide, please. Don't be afraid. This is a complex slide. I'm not going to tackle it in detail. I've given that unfortunate task to other people after me. But just to tell you all that in essence, the clinical trial application and authorization process now has three major components, three major phases. One is the validation phase, takes about 10 days. Assessment phase, to be split up in a harmonized part in which member states work together, and a national part in which the member states concerned evaluate everything from their side, from their national side. That part here in blue will take 45 days. And then there's a notification part to bring that all together, which is supposed to take 5 days. I promise not to discuss the slide in detail. Just one detail that I still want to tell you. There is a possibility in these validation and assessment periods to ask for additional questions. That prolongs the process with, for the validation, 10 days. For the assessment, it's 31 days. Second point that I want to point out, it's on the slide as well, is that for specific products like ATMPs, there is a possibility for prolongations as well. But all these timelines, as I said earlier, are maximum timelines. If at the end of that timeline, the member state did not give an approval, the application will be tacitly approved. Next slide, please. Some additional processes, again, they will be tackled by other colleagues later in this day. There is a new system for substantial modifications, combined with some possibilities to make changes to the application that are not substantial but relevant for the supervision. There is a ways to add new member states to the process. It's logical if your additional application is done in close collaboration. If member states need to be added, this is done again through a collaborative process. Next slide, please. Notification of the important periods and the important milestones in a trial, like the start of the trial, the end of the trial, are all tackled through the clinical trial information system. That's very different compared to the current situation. There is a possibility for member states to take proactive measures, and that also happens through the clinical trial information system. And as I said, the safety reporting is streamlined, is simplified with collaboration amongst member states to assess suspected unexpected serious adverse reactions, or SUSARs, and annual safety reports. So the national treatment of those different safety reporting obligations is simplified. Next slide, please. Union controls, as I said, that's a way for Commission to control that member states correctly supervise compliance with the regulation, and that outside third countries offer equivalent protection of the rights and the safety of participants and the reliability of the generated data compared to the European system. What is new and will be quite revolutionary is that reports with the findings and recommendations resulting from those union controls shall be submitted through the EU portal. And the basic rule, if something is submitted through the European portal, then it's public information, so that will come into the public. Next slide, please. A few words on the different transition periods. From the questions that some of you asked on forehand, we saw that was a topic that needed some additional explanation. So next slide, please. There are different transition periods and different transitions foreseen from the current legislation to the future one. I'm starting with something that is perhaps rather theoretical. There was under the clinical trial directive a possibility to continue with research that was ongoing before that directive started applying in 2004. That those trials are not in line with the new system. They cannot continue after the entry into application. So after the 31st of January 2022, trials that started before 2005 cannot continue. As I said, I personally think this should be a theoretical exercise. They can, however, of course, be translated into a new application under the CTR and submitted and authorized as such. Next slide will contain the more usual transition modalities, I think. The transition from the current system, the clinical trial directive, to the clinical trial regulation. And the lawmaker, of course, understood that you cannot have a single cutoff date in which all trials need to, from one day to another, change regime and change underlying rules. So the CTR, as such, allows to start and conduct a clinical trial in accordance with the current system during the transition period of 1 year after its application date, which means that in the year to come, from the 31st of January 22 until 2023, you can, as a sponsor, choose to submit either under the CTR system or under the CTD system for a given protocol. There is a second transition period in there that allows clinical trials authorized under the clinical trial directive before the 1st of January 2023 to continue until 31st of January 2025. So that's still 3 years from now. Nevertheless, when that transitional period ends in 2025, it is not required to either apply a transitional application through under the CTR system in order to transfer the trial to the CTR regime or to stop the trial. Important to mention as well is that trials that have the end of trial notified in all member states before that 31st of January 2025 will not need to be transitioned even when the global end of trial has not been reached yet. And to tackle all the legal obligations stemming from the directive, UDRACT and the European Clinical Trial Register will be kept open for a few years. Next slide, please. What is the transition period? What is the transition process? Ongoing trials which are compliant with the CTR and are not subject to any ongoing assessment, so that do not have a substantial amendment ongoing in any European or EEA country, those trials can be transitioned. A request can be made through the CTR principles. If necessary, those ongoing trials should be amended to make sure that they are compliant with the principles of the CTR. This needs to be completed in time for the assessment of the compliant CTA under the clinical trial regulation. And it's the sponsor's responsibility to ensure compliance. These are all a lot of difficult words and difficult principles to just summarize and say, if you have a trial that will run after the 31st of January 2025, please assure that you have enough time to make that trial compliant with the CTR and subsequently to submit it under the CTR regimes. There is a lot more information in the Commission Q&A published in the website B. I think I have 1 or 2 slides left. So next slide, please. Just for the details to apply for a transition file, that's an initial application according to the CTR based on all the last authorized versions of the dossier under the CTD. There are a few new documents. You need to write a cover letter, which is logical. If you go to an authority, to a member state, you need to explain what you're doing. There is the CTR application itself, so that's comparable to the UDRACT application form, but now in CTIS. And of course, you need to have a harmonized or a consolidated protocol for multi-country trials. There are some documents that are mandatory under the CTR, of course. All Part 1 and Part 2 documents need to be submitted in their last approved version, but it's not necessary to prepare new versions for CTIS submission. That means that if your investigator's brochure has a UDRAC number, that's not really an issue, just as long as the information in it is in line with the CTR. So important to mention there as well that the language regimes, of course, apply. Giving an example there, if the member state you're submitting to has the obligation to submit the protocol synopsis in its national language, then you need to make that translations. And lastly, and taking away some concerns there as well, as a sponsor, you're not expected to update every particular of the trial, including the labeling immediately after the authorization of the trial under the CTR. We're quite aware that this is not always possible. Labels that are on clinical trial sites, of course, it's not necessary to withdraw those and to relabel this as soon as the CTR starts applying. No, those can be used until that documentation is brought in line with the CTR requirements at the time of the first revision. Taking the example again of clinical trial labeling, if that labeling is revised, if that labeling needs to be revised, it's only at that moment when you will need to put on the particulars required under the CTR. There is, by the way, also a CTFG best practice guide for sponsors of multinational clinical trials to tell you how to make that harmonized or consolidated. I think, next slide, please. I'm at the end of my presentation. This is just a schematic way to tell you through those three arrows at the bottom of the slide that submission according to the clinical trial directive stops on 31st of January 2023. The execution of an authorized trial according to the CTD will need to stop on the 31st of January 2025. And from the 31st of January 2022, you can submit and execute a trial according to the CTR principles. I've put a nice red dot in the middle of that timeline on the top of the slide to indicate to you that we're just before the applicability of the CTR. So you can submit yet according to the CTR, but in 63 days, as my director just told you, to do that. I think next slide, this was all that I had to say. I want to give you some guidance and some advice. If you would need information on CTR submissions next to the quite a good and quite a complete website of EMA, you will also find some information on the Commission's website, including templates for things like investigator CVs, the declarations you need to do in part 2. So this is all on this website. With that, next slide, please. Colleagues, thank you for your attention and up to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christophe, for this excellent overview of the clinical trials regulation. Now we will move into the second module of session 1, which is about hearing about the stakeholders' experience with the clinical trials regulation and specifically its implementation. And we have started to receive some questions, and one is about how does an organization can start to practically prepare for for implementing the regulation. And I think it will be really interesting to hear from the different stakeholders so on this topic. So I will give the floor first to Stephanie Cromar. Stephanie is a senior regulatory affairs manager with the EORTC, and she's responsible for the preparation, submission, and follow-up of clinical trials applications from development until completion. Stephanie has experience on the VHP and the recent pilot phases, and also provides regulatory advice on these topics. She's one of the sponsor product owners under the new CTIS delivery model and has been involved in the implementation of the new clinical trials regulation. Stephanie, I'll give you the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you a lot for this introduction, and good morning to everybody. So after this oversight that was provided of the regulation by Christophe, knowing now, I think all of you know that the regulation will be the CTIs will go live next year on the 31st January. I would like to give you a little bit of an insight of what are the 7 main points of impact of the regulation from ERTC perspective. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So here are the 7 main points that were identified by ERTC as being really key aspects to be taken into consideration, and I would like to share them today with you in short, of course, because we don't have a lot of time. So if we could move towards the next slide, please. So the first point that I would like to share with you that we identified was about the timelines and the submission strategy. As Christophe explained today, we are under the directive, and the directive allows differences among countries. With the regulation, one of the key aspects would be the harmonization and also harmonization of timelines. So here I wanted to show a little bit of an example on how these timelines will be when the regulation will be there. And here it's an example of the initial submission, and as you can see, you have the initial submission that will be divided in 3 parts. Here I'm missing the decision part, but I will let you know. So the validation, the assessment. For the validation, as you can see, it can take from 10 to 25 days in case of RFIs on the completion of this validation, and these RFIs can take 10 days for you to reply. And then during the assessment, you have 45 days and up to 76 days. This can be increased in case of RFIs, and for sure, in order to reply to RFIs during the completion or during the assessment, this can take up to 12 days as compared to the validation. In that case, you have 10 days to reply. So as you can see, the times are quite fixed, but in case of RFIs, you will not have a lot of time to reply. 10-day validation and assessment 12 days. If we go to the next slide, please. So here I wanted to show you what will be the timelines in case of substantial modifications. And here you will see that for the validation, you will go to 6 days up to maximum 21 days in case of RFIs. And here again, you can see that in case of RFIs, you will have 10 days to reply again as in the initial submission. And for the assessment, you will have 38 days of assessment that can go up to 69 days in case of RFIs. And this here for the sponsor, again, as in the initial, you will have 12 days to reply. And indeed, in the initial submission, as for the substantial modification, then each member state will come with a decision, and this within 5 days. So if we go to the next slide, please. So here I wanted to show you that indeed one of the key aspects also with the regulation is the quantity of notification that we will need to do. I will not go here in detail of all the kind of type of notifications, but just to highlight again the short timelines that we will have also to declare them and the importance of having a good coordination. So in order to be able to notify via the CTIS portal of all these notifications, as you can see on trial progress, you have notifications that you need to declare within 15 days, recruitment as well, incidents varying. For instance, the serious breaches, you have only 7 days. So that being said, if we can go to the next slide, please. So here I wanted just to show you how the submission strategy will be. So as you know, under the regulation, we speak about part 1 and part 2. So you can opt for a submission strategy that goes in parallel with part 1 and part 2, or you can go for a staggered approach that is being shown there in the right. This means that you can submit your part 1, and within 2 years after the conclusion of this part 2, you can go for the part 2 submission, or you can have a combination of both strategies for a particular trial as well. So that's also an important aspect to take into account when launching a submission. So if we go to the next slide, please. So here it's a second point that I wanted to explain you is about the key study documentation. So with regulation, and you will see it in the Annex 1 of the regulation, there are all the kind of documents that you will need to submit. And there are, of course, new documents like, for instance, the recruitment arrangement, suitability of investigators, suitability of facilities that you may have already seen by some countries that launch a pilot phase, like Spain, for instance. So if we go to the next slide, please. I wanted also to let you know that there will be some updates. So as you could see in ODRALEX 10, there is a new harmonized CV template. There are also in the Annex 1 of the regulation, but also in the regulation itself, there is new updates in regards to the content of the protocol and the informed consent form. There are also new documents that will be required, the lay language protocol synopsis, and here I put all the points that needs to be contained in this language protocol synopsis. And then there is also the lay language summary of results to be provided within 1 year after your end of trial. So if we go to the next slide, please. So here, one of other aspects that were identified as key aspect is this transition period that was already well explained by Christophe, so I will not explain that, just to highlight the fact that indeed there is 3 years. It can be feel as a long time, but it can go fast. So organize really well yourself in order to transition your trials in a timely manner, keeping into account the fact that once you move your trial, it will be taking more or less 60 days for validation, and then your trial falls within all the requirement of the regulation. So this is really important to take into account. And then, of course, during the initial year, you can still have the possibility of, if you want to submit an initial trial under the directive, that's also an important factor to take into account. So as I put there, assess your strategy for migration and ensure well that after these 3 years, all your trials are ended under CTD or then moved towards the CTIS portal. If we go to next slide, please. So the CTR will be there, but there are key compliance considerations to take into account. There are also other guidelines, other regulations, so don't forget about them. They are there, and they need also to be taken into account. So if we move to next slide, please. So here it's another aspect that we also have on daily work is the management of different types of stakeholders. We interact with intergroups, with companies, with liaison officers and other sponsors. And if we go to the next slide, please. So here I wanted to highlight the fact that the notion of the sponsor remains the same as for the directive, but there is with the regulation this new notion of co-sponsorship. So that means the joint responsibilities among different sponsors that can be co-shared. These, of course, there is a need for splitting the responsibilities in 3 aspects, which means one of the sponsors will need to take into charge the authorization of initial substantial modification of clinical trial. There is one of them that will need to be the contact point for all the questions from subjects, PIs, or regulatory bodies. And there is one that will be responsible for implementing the measures issued during audits and inspections. So this is really important, that even though the notion exists, these 3 responsibilities should be clearly shared among them. And then for non-new sponsors, as you know, today under the directive, there is already this notion of legal representation, which will be there also under the regulation, but under the regulation, the notion will expand a little bit because the legal representative will need to ensure compliance with the CTR. Under the directive, it was more a role of communication. So if we go to next slide, please. Here, one of the key aspects also of the regulation is the transparency. Normally, all information, all documents that you will upload in the portal will become publicly available. This, of course, will not be the case in case you need to protect personal data also in case there is protection of commercially confidential information, and also protecting the confidential communication between member states in preparation to the assessment report. There is also the notion of deferrals depending on the category of your trials that also is to be taken into account, which means that depending on the category, certain documents will be deferred after the end of trial if needed. So if we go to the next slide, yes, and a last key aspect that we identified is the user management. You know that one of the key elements of this regulation is the CTIS portal, and there are two approaches that can be selected depending on the type of organization you are. There is the organization-centric or trial-centric approach. So the organization-centric is more seen for big organization, and there a high-level administrator will be required. And here the management of users by administrator is at an organization level, and here the user will become affiliated to the organization of this high level, and this to be opposed as to the trial-centric approach, which is available only to the sponsor. And here I would say it's an approach to be taken by small academias or maybe by a PI. Okay, so thank you all.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, for your presentation. I will now give the floor to Andrea Seider-Gletzer. Andrea is head of the project management and member of the executive board with the Coordination Center for Clinical Trials at the Heidelberg University Hospital in Germany. Andrea gained some years' experience in the pharmaceutical industry and then joined the University Hospital in Heidelberg about 10 years ago. The University Hospital provides services to support investigators of clinical trials in academic institutions and small businesses. Since March 2020, Andrea is part of EMA's clinical trials information system testing as a representative of academia on behalf of the German University Hospital Heidelberg Network, an association of 26 clinical trial centers, all located at medical faculties and university hospitals involved in clinical trials. Andrea, I think it will be excellent to hear from you on the implementation of the regulation from the academic sector perspective. Thank you very much.
Okay, good morning. Thanks a lot for giving me the word. And as you already heard from Stephanie, a very nice overview of all the impact the CTR has on our daily business. I would like to go into some more practical details, and maybe you can go to the next slide. That's a little bit, as you heard, there's a lot to think about, and I just picked out 4 items that we are right now thinking a lot about, and that's the new processes we will have to install, the user management, as Stephanie already mentioned, the transition period, it has been discussed a lot about this already, and the timelines and documents. Next slide, please. I want to start with the user management. As I know, a lot of organizations and institutions have already decided to go with the organization-centric or the trial-centric approach, but a lot also have not done so. Heidelberg University decided to go with the organization-centric approach, and the preparations are continuing, like affiliation letters and everything will be submitted in a few weeks. But there is a lot more to consider about the user management, and that's the point where we are at the moment. So we are just thinking who in our organization needs access to the CTIS. And that's something that each organization must do on their own, how to organize with this system. Probably a lot of academic institutions will use the CT admin role because it covers everything. But if not, you really have to be aware what different role profiles can see and what they will be able to do. Also, it's not only the submission process anymore, it's submissions, notifications, answering, it's reporting, it's safety. So it's a whole trial life cycle, and people who have access to CTIS will be responsible for a lot of things in the system. We are also thinking, what about external partners? How will we provide access to them, or they will provide access for us? So what about other partners in CROs we are including? So that's a lot to think about. And also working with industry partners, like the use of the QIMPD role, or will we still work with cross-reference letters, which will probably be the most preferred thing to do. And it's a lot of work to do, and CTIS needs to be checked on a daily basis. So it's not just the submission, it's the trial life cycle as stated before. Next slide, please. So what approaches can we use here? We can either go a decentralized where everyone, or in our organization, each project manager would have access to CTIS and would be able to submit on their own for their trials. Or if we go the other way and do it in a more centralized approach, where all the people submit to the CTIS specialist or CTIS manager, whoever you call it. And this one is the only one who has access to CTIS and will submit all the documents in there. So that's what we are thinking about, and that's, it's not an easy decision, and it has to be really evaluated in your organization how you want to proceed with the access to CTIS. Next slide, please. The other point is the transition period. I think I mentioned it in the last webinar for academia that the transition period is sort of, not clear to us, and it causes a lot of uncertainties. We now started to find out which trials will be finished until 2025, and which trials we will have to move to the new CTR. We are also, for every new project, we are thinking, can it now be submitted under the new CTR in the beginning of 2022? And which ones should we submit under the old directive? So these are the points we try to find out or figure out at the moment. And we are not really prepared to start. We must mention that, because documents have not adapted so far. So we have to continue work on this. And we are still not clear what is the cost impact of transition, always a big problem for academia, because we don't have that much money for transition, and it will be a lot of additional work, and maybe it will be additional fees. We are not sure about that yet. So that's a little bit unclear how to manage this. Also, the time management for the transition, as we have fixed funding periods, and we have to find out how to fit it in if we have to transition a trial under the new CTR. We are already discussing with sponsors and investigators and inform them and think about the strategy, what we should do, what they want us to do, and that's what's going on at the moment. Next slide, please. Yeah, another point that is really has a lot of impact is the timelines. As Stephanie already mentioned and showed you, the timelines will really tighten up, and we have to see how we can deal with this. In academia, we are thinking that trial preparation period will extend a lot, and we will have to do a much better preparation. We need better documents. We need all documents checked. We need all signatures. We need complete and correct documents. And all this process will take much more time than it does now. Also, some processes we started a little bit late, maybe in academia, will have to move to the beginning, like creation of DSMV charter and contracting and all the stuff regarding DSMV. We have new documents like recruitment arrangements and new processes. We have the deferrals and the publication of documents to be discussed and maybe to be clarified in advance. And we also might have to put this in contractual arrangements with our partners so that we are clear what to defer and what can be published. Yeah, next slide. Also, a new process will be the serious breach as an example. This comes up and is a little bit challenging because none of us have experience with serious breaches. So there's a lot of uncertainty about this process. We are right now thinking, what to do, who is reporting, how to report, who will be responsible, who will be involved in assessments, who can do it. We don't have 24 hours, 7 days a week, so we have to see how to deal with this and how to document all this, and then finally how to report the serious breach. So this is the process, what we think about in the moment. Next slide, please. So in summary, this is what we are doing now. We think about which roles will we use and who is responsible for the user management, how we will work with this. Yeah, in this case, who should get access to CTIS and has the team the ability to handle if we centralize the access to CTIS? Do we have the manpower to go to the CTIS each day and to cover all the periods of absence from persons? And yeah, that's what we discuss at the moment. We have to write a lot of new standard operating procedures, but that's the same for everyone, I guess. We changed the sequence of preparation processes. We try to define new process like serious breaches. We try to catch up which documents need to be changed and which need to be created, all new. We are updating templates like the protocol template and implement all the points to consider regarding the CTR. We train, advise, and discuss with our partners and mostly with our investigators at the sites. And we try to get as much information and training as possible to be prepared, like the event today. I think the next slide is a thank you. Yeah.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Andrea. We will now move to the next presentation from Julien Romanetto from Transgene. So here about the experience from the small businesses, experience with the implementation of the regulation. Julien is a qualified pharmacist and joined Transgene in 2018 as a regulatory affairs manager. He's working as a regulatory representative in different project teams in charge of clinical trial submission and maintenance activities. He's also responsible for the regulatory intelligence and part of Transgene's clinical trial regulation preparation working group. He represents the company in FPR, SMEs, and ATMP's working groups, and in France biotech clinical trials and ATMP working groups. Julien, I give you the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Konstantinos, and let's go for the presentation of Transgene experience as an SME company with the clinical trial regulation preparation. Next slide, please. So following an introduction on Transgene features, I will present you the 3 steps method followed in our current Ctr preparation: identify, inform, prepare, and implement. Some comments and challenges experienced in this preparation so far, and some advices. Next slide, please. This introduction slide to illustrate how your SME company can be similar to changing situation in the Ctr preparation. In our pipeline of investigational gene therapy products in oncology, we have 6 ongoing clinical trials at time of Ctr and 3 into force, and new clinical trials on the way that will need to be submitted after this Ctr activation. Another point to consider in the setting of the Ctis organization, we can externalize some country or clinical trial activity to CROs, even if mainly proceeding in-house, and we have no EU affiliate. Next slide, please. Last general point, we take the option to make this transition as simple as possible, focusing on needed adaptations. On a different approach, some companies may take the opportunity of the Ctr to do a complete overhaul of their clinical trial management process. Moving to changing Ctr preparation, we started with identification, meaning identification of Ctr preparation reference company members. Depending the size of your company, it could be even a single person. In our case, we built the Ctr preparation working group with 1 member for clinical quality assurance, 1 member for regulatory affairs, and 1 member for clinical trial management. Next slide, please. Second ongoing step is to prepare, inform and prepare. These 2 actions being complementary and conducted in parallel. To inform, we had an initial training to detail Ctr to clinical department as part of the company QA training plan. Then the working group spreads important Ctr status updates through regular written and oral communications. Next slide, please. Considering the preparation step, working the Ctr text and all training material released over time has been needed. Based on this review of the documents, an impact analysis has been conducted. As illustrated in such impact analysis, listing the article of the Ctr, you assess which one have an impact on your activities, define actions, responsible and timeline objectives. This is a living document that defines all needed action as, for example, our procedure and document templates adaptations. User persona exercise is another action. It's a company organization CTS role mapping well defined in EMEA CTIS training material, where you define for each function that should be active in the system, their clinical trial activities, and consequent role to be allocated in the system. Sarah will detail it in session 2. Next slide, please. Other action completed between organization-centric approach and trial-centric approach. We validated the first option and assigned CTIS sponsor administrators, which are the very first step in order to be able to use CTIS when it will go live. We are still working on CTIS user training plan and clinical trial transition timetable definition. Next slide, please. Lastly, the implementation of the user training plan prior to transitioning clinical trials has to be completed. Next slide, please. Now, I would like to share with you some comments and challenges experienced during our Ctr preparation. A question already asked by other sponsor representatives in previous CTIS webinar was on the potential existence of a CTIS sandbox to test the system. The good news, communicated by EMEA in between, was a phased rollout of such CTIS sandbox system from mid-November with a user needs survey that some of you may have completed. Access to sandbox system date is not yet communicated to my knowledge for SME and academia, but it will be an important preparation tool to feel confident with the use of CTIS real system. One important point to consider in Ctr preparation, which should be common to most SME companies, is the characteristics of the clinical trial portfolio. We have a limited number of active clinical trials, mainly early phase clinical trials with a single or few numbers of participating countries. It is then quite impossible to define priority level between them and identify one clinical trial that could be used as a test with no significant damage if the process is going painful to test it in transition. This is why our current thinking is not to immediately engage in CTIS transition activity from February next year, and we would really appreciate some real-life figures and number experience from health authority in the first month of the transition period to validate the transition initiation effective starting point that we will define for our first clinical trials. When the CTR coordinated review approach should be beneficial, different comments emerge from team members around the amount of operational and planning work for transitioning ongoing clinical trials and for new clinical trials under the CTR, like the period with no clinical trial amendment possible when transitioning ongoing clinical trials, the challenge of short response period for small project team in SME organization, then with low possibility of requesting temporarily additional resources from other teams, and no possibility of time extension request to address the question, especially for part 1, part 2, parallel submission. Laura will explain different rules for publication of phase 1, phase 1-2 CTA documents in session 2. While this is not in my slide, we have more and more questions emerging on the member state assessment criteria to review this request and consequence level of justification needed and operational work needed. Raw version for publication without CC versus not for publication has to be developed based on this assessment criteria. The last bullet point, challenge, are specific to clinical development of investigational ATMPs containing GMOs, which correspond to the nature of all transgene products and may be not applicable to you. Even if these topics seem new in mind of EU regulators, unfortunately, GMO environmental risk assessment will not be coordinated in CTR review at time of CTR entry into force. There were also comments on additional assessment times that can still be applied to any ATMP in the regulation. Next slide, please. I will end with few advice proposals for your CTR preparation based on our experience so far. Firstly, there is no drama if you have not really initiated your CTR preparation. Nevertheless, it's really time to start now. From what we experience, the earlier your CTR preparation starts, the smoother your CTR should be. One first point is to nominate Ctr specialists in your organization. A good support in the preparation work, there is massive high-quality training materials that has been developed by European authorities for CTS setup, including some tailored for SME companies. Pia will detail them later in session 5 of the webinar. You will then not have to develop your own CTIS documents from scratch. Another point to find is a good timing for your user training activation, considering your planned CTR activation timing. Not to be too in advance and to have to refresh or to repeat your training. Last point, instead of revamping all your clinical trial processes, some experience and processes already in place for other health authority clinical web portals, clinicaltrial.gov, Audacity, could be used when applicable. Next slide, please. And last word before the Q&A session, I would like to thank all transgene clinical and quality colleagues for their work, which allowed to buy this presentation, and to thank European authority staff involved in the preparation of this webinar for their work on the preparation on it, including the one who are not appearing in the program. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much indeed. Focusing now on the Clinical Trials Information System, I'm very pleased that we have 3 speakers who will outline different aspects. If we start with Ana Rodriguez. Ana, holds a PhD in molecular microbiology and has worked in the pharmaceutical industry and at EMA. At EMA, where she, after joining in 2003, she became head of clinical and non-clinical compliance service and has been absolutely instrumental in the building of the clinical trials information system. And currently, Anna acts as the Deputy Programme Manager for our implementation on the Clinical Trials Regulation and Clinical Trials Information System. So Anna, over to you to tell us about access and user management roles and permissions. Anna, thank you.
Hello, good morning to everyone, and thank you, Peter, for the introduction. I think during my presentation today, I would like to emphasize some relevant aspects in relation to access and user management in relation to Ctis, as well as give you an overview of the sponsor roles and the high-level permissions attached to the roles. So perhaps you can go to the third slide, which is the content of the presentation. Which indicates what I'm going to cover today. So perhaps we can move then to the next slide, please. Okay, here just to start that if you want to use Ctis, the first step is to get the credentials to access the system, and to obtain these credentials you can go directly to the EMA account management system where you can follow the process that is indicated there, or alternatively what you can do is to try to navigate to the sponsor workspace, which is available from the Ctis welcome page, and there you will see that there is, as highlighted here in orange, you have the option register a new user. So from here you can click on that option and you will be navigated to complete a registration form where you will have to provide some personal details, user details, and also an email address, and you will have also to follow some steps and include some additional information like replying certain questions that will be useful in case you forget your user credential. And then you will finally need to confirm the information that you have provided in your registration form and your email account detail that will be provided you. And for that, you will receive via email a token that you will need to add as indicated in step 4 here. And when this is done, you can submit this form and automatically you will receive a notification via email containing all the registration information. And you have a video clip that explains how to do this in our module 3 of the training material that is available from our website. Please bear in mind that if you are already a user of other EMA applications, you can skip, let's say, this step because you can use already these credentials to log in Ctis as well. So next slide, please. Once you get your credential, obviously you will see that you can log in Ctis, and you will get or inherit what we call a default role that will allow you to perform a minimum number of activities in the system. As you can see in the right side, first of all, you will be able to update your personal profile if needed, and what is more important is that when you log in the first time, you enter your employer information because it's the only way the administrators will know, will understand, and the employer of the user that are involved in the conduct of trials on behalf of that sponsor organization. And you, in fact, will receive warning message constantly to ensure that you register your employer information. Another, below the personal profile, you have my roles. Here from this section, you will be able to view what are the roles that have been assigned to you by the administrator, but also you will have the option to request a role to the administrator. And I have to say that this is something that applies only in the sponsor workspace, and it does not exist in the authority workspace, which the assignation of role, it happens only by invitation by the administrators. And then in the left side, you can see that another permission in the default role is the possibility to initiate the creation of a clinical trial application. However, the user will only be able to proceed depending if the approach that follows is the city-centric approach versus the organization-centric, and I will explain what does it mean in real practice. But as a key message is that the default role is not enough. It gives you some permissions, but they are very limited. So if you need to perform city-related activities in CTIS, you will need to be assigned with business roles. Next slide, please. And this brings us to the hierarchy of the user management in CTIS. As you can see, we have at the top of, we have two types of administrator, which let's say are at the top of the pyramid, and then we will have in the base of the pyramid all the business users that will in fact will be the ones that will perform the business processes in CTIS. With regards to the sponsor administrators, we have at the top the high-level administrator that in the case of the sponsor group of users is the sponsor admin, and this is a role that is not assigned in CTIS, but is assigned in the EMA account management system that support identity and access management, IAM. And this role, the organization, the sponsor organization, will need to submit a request in the EMA account management system to be able to assign this role to one of their users, and they will have to provide certain information that will need to be validated by EMEA. So when the first sponsor administrator has been assigned with the role, then this user would be able also in IAM to create backups or assign the same roles to other users within that sponsor organization. But all of this will happen outside CTIS. So when the sponsor admin has its roles, the user can log in CTIS and then can assign what we call the medium-level administrator, the clinical trial admin, or even directly can assign business roles. I would like to emphasize the clinical trial administrator is in fact a super user because on top of being an administrator, it has mapped also the permission of all business roles. So in fact, it would be able to perform all activities in relation to CTAs, notifications, and summary of results. As you can see in the right side, both of administrators will be able to manage users, meaning that they will be able to assign a new role to a user and also CT access. And this means because when you assign a role, you have the option to assign the role with the scope all trials, meaning that the user can use that role for all trials within that sponsor organization, or you can assign a role with a scope-specific trial, meaning that this role can be used only for that particular trial. This administrator can also amend role of CT access, and this is related to the period of validity of the role, where the administrator can extend it or shorten this period of validity. And then they can also revoke the role, meaning in those cases where the users should not be involved anymore in the conduct of trials in CTIS. And as I explained previously, you have also the option for individual user to, from my roles, as I explained previously, to request a role to an administrator, and therefore this administrator will be able to approve or reject those users' requests. And just to highlight that both administrator, sponsor admin, and clinical trial admin are available in what we call the organization-centric approach. However, in the context of the city-centric, we will have only the clinical trial administrator, which in fact is a role that is assigned automatically by the system, as you will see in my next slide. And you will have all the business users that will be responsible to perform all related activities. And please bear in mind that all these users need to be self-registered as the starting point of the whole process. So next slide, please. This is just to illustrate what is the difference between the organization-centric versus trial-centric approach, which in fact is something that is automatically applied by the system on the basis of the existence of a sponsor administrator linked to the sponsor organization that is selected in the clinical trial application. So normally a user will log in, and once logged in, as I explained previously, they will have this default role that will allow the user to initiate the creation of a clinical trial application. When you initiate the creation, you have to enter the trial number, and then you have to enter the sponsor organization. What happens is that based on the sponsor organization that you have selected, the system will check in the backend if this sponsor organization has an sponsor administrator registered in the EMA account management system. And if that is the case, then the system will follow the organization-centric approach, and the user, in fact, will not be able to proceed with the creation of the clinical trial application unless this user has been assigned with the role of the clinical trial administrator with a scope of trials by the sponsor administrator of that particular organization. However, if the system does not identify that there is a sponsor administrator linked to that organization, the user will be able to proceed and create a clinical trial application, and that user will become automatically clinical trial administrator, but for this specific clinical trial, meaning only with a scope specific trial for the trial application that has been created. Obviously, EMEA will encourage all organizations to follow the organization-centric approach, as we'll explain the advantages and disadvantages in the next slide. And this is a little bit probably more burdensome, but I think it's much more secure, and you will need to ensure your organization, your sponsor organization, is already registered in the organization management system here at EMEA, and then you will have, as explained previously, to register your sponsor administrator in the EMEA account management system, and you have a specific video clip in our training module 7 on how to do this. And please be aware that the registration of sponsor administrators was open from the 1st of September of this year. Next slide, please. Here is just to give you some flavor of what are the advantages and disadvantages of both approaches. And the organization-centric, it creates the opportunity for a more centralized management of actors and roles across trial within one organization, meaning that the sponsor administrator will have a good oversight of all users that are involved in the conduct of trials under the umbrella of that particular organization, and would be able to manage those users in terms of revoking or giving, assigning roles, or city access. It improves security because, as I explained previously, a user can only create a trial under the organization-centric approach if this user has been assigned with the clinical trial administrator role by the sponsor administrator. Otherwise, the user will not be able to proceed. And also, it will prevent duplication, in particular with regards to organization details. It's true that it's more burdensome for organizations because they need to have the organization registered in OMS, and they will need to register an sponsor admin. But I think in general, the balance is more positive than negative if you follow this approach. The city-centric, in fact, was created to facilitate the conduct of clinical trial by academia, especially in those cases where the sponsors, investigators, sponsors will conduct 1 or 2 trials in their life, and then will allow a faster CTA process because it's less burdensome, as you have seen previously. However, they have important inconvenience and in terms of security, because anyone can create a trial for the same sponsor organization running independently, and there will not be oversight by anyone with that sponsor organization to know who is doing clinical trials on their behalf. And there could be also issues with regards to data quality and integrity in relation to the organization information. Next slide. Here I try to illustrate the difference between the organization-centric and give us as an example of potential academic sponsor, where in the case of the organization-centric, we would expect, for example, that at the level of the direction of the hospital, perhaps 1 or 2 users are registered as sponsor administrators, and they will be assigned with the Cta admin role for all trials, and then perhaps they can initiate the creation of trials, meaning generate the U numbers, and then this can assign these numbers to users in the different services that are intended to conduct clinical trials on behalf of that organization. And the user in these services may be assigned with the role Cta admin, and then they are assigned with a specific clinical trial, so meaning with the U number that has been generated by the sponsor administrator. So, and then the user in these different services, they will be able to conduct the trial, but there will be always someone at the top of the organization that will be able to have an oversight of the trials that are being conducted under the umbrella of this organization, but the different hospital services. Obviously, this overview is completely lost if you don't have, if you follow the city-centric approach. The different services still will be able to conduct their trials, but they will be run completely independently from the different services, and no one will have oversight of what is happening. Next slide, please. And here, just to finalize, is to give you an overview of what are the roles and permissions, high-level permission attached of this role. As you have seen from previous slide, we have at the top the administrators, we have the sponsor admin, and we have the Cta admin. Both apply in the case of the organization-centric approach. The Cta admin only apply in the case of the city-centric approach, and it's automatic. It's a role that is automatically assigned by the system. And then you have here the different roles. Viewer, the nomenclature we use for the roles, as you can see, is split into part. One is the area, the business area in which the role will act. So if it's part 1, part 2, office notification, or city results. And then you have this difference between viewer, preparer, and submitter. Please bear in mind that submitter are always preparer, and viewer and preparer are always viewer. So, and as you can see here, for example, the viewers, you have part 1 viewers, so meaning that they will be able to view part 1 instead the quality part, and in the case of the preparer, it's the same. This will be able to prepare part 1 instead the quality part, and then you have the part 2 viewer, which can view part 2, and the part 2 preparer, we can prepare part 2 application, or the quality AMPD viewer that can view quality AMPD, but not part 1 or 2, and the preparer that can prepare this part, and so on. So I'm not going to go into the details, but I think it's easy to understand based on the naming of the role. And then you have the submitter that, let's say, are the super users. So in the sense that application submitter will be able not only to prepare and is expected to be supervisor, people that will review what the preparer are done, and when that is done, they will be able to submit information to the database, and the same apply for notification submitter in the case of notification, and city results submitter in the case of the results. And then you have the ASR submitter. I have to say that the Cta admin has mapped the permission of all these roles except the ASR submitter. So if you need to submit also annual safety reports, you need to add this role on top. And if you don't have many users in this organization, we recommend you to make it simple and use only this Cta admin role, which can perform all the activities in the system, and add on top the ASR submitter to have a complete profile for sponsors. And just move to the last slide in my presentation. And this is just for you to understand the concept of what are the permissions attached to viewer, preparer, and submitter roles. So if you are a viewer, mainly what you can do is view structured data and documents, and also download that information from the system. Obviously, these are viewer roles. These roles will never perform any business activity in the system. Then you have the preparers. The preparer are the one that obviously will be involved in the creation or the preparation of the clinical trial application, notification, summary of the results, meaning that they will be able to edit the structured data and they will be able to upload documents, they will be able to save the draft of the information that has been entered with regard to the application or notification, etc. And they will be able also to cancel those drafts if required. And then you have the submitter, which obviously they can prepare as well, but on top what they are responsible, they will have enabled the submit button, meaning that they will be able to submit information from the portal, the workspace in which a sponsor user will be working, to the EU database, and this will have consequences because the information then will be made publicly available through the public portal. And obviously there are other permissions linked to the administrator role that I explained previously. And I think with that is the key aspect that I wanted to highlight for the presentation today, and I stop here. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anna. Really clear and really important in helping people navigate the registration process. We've got a number of questions coming in, but I'll hold them to the end. And if we move then straight on to the next presentation is from Sarah Scales. Sarah is Change Management Officer for the Clinical Trials Information System, Ctis. She's responsible for communication planning at EMA, the Ctis user personas, and leading sponsor organisation modelling for Ctis from an EMA perspective. Prior to her current role, she has worked as a software product manager and as a consultant on new technology projects for both the European Commission and various European agencies. Sarah, you are going to tell us about user personas and organisational models. Over to you, please.
Excellent. So indeed, today I will be talking about the CTIS user personas and organization models and how both of these tools can be used to better understand how to apply CTIS in your own organization and with your own people. So next slide, please. And we can continue on again. Great. So first of all then, what is a user persona? A user persona is a visual model used to represent different stakeholder groups. So what user personas do is look inside user organizations, like inside, for example, academic hospitals, research groups, and SMEs, to see who does what when it comes to clinical trials regulatory submissions. And particularly for these user personas, it's then how these people can best use CTIS. So looking at their tasks in CTIS and also their user roles. What user personas do is group users whose basic tasks and needs are similar so that we can understand how they can best use a technology tool. And for CTIS, the personas can be used in a couple of ways, both to understand how you need to train different kinds of people that are working on clinical trials in your organization, and also indeed helping to best assign user roles to these people. Next slide, please. So I know we're short on time. I don't want to go too much into detail on these personas, but just to give you a flavor of the user personas that have been created for SME and academia that will use CTIS. We have a couple here, for example, a study coordinator, clinical trial submission specialist, which may be in a larger organization where there's more clinical trials and people dedicated to working on clinical trials, or in quite small academic studies, it may even be the study nurse who is responsible for submitting to CTIS. These are the personas that were created as part of a user persona activity done by EMA. But you may see that there are different kinds of people in your organization that will actually interact with CTIS or that have a part to play in regulatory submissions. So really the personas that have been created are a starting point for you to start looking into your own organization. And that's something that I think Julian already mentioned and explained quite well. So next slide, please. We have published the above personas that we just saw on the EMA CTIS training and support page. So I encourage you to look at those personas, as mentioned, see if you think that they fit well with your organization and the kinds of people you have working in clinical trials. Things may need to be tweaked. That's quite normal because different organizations work differently. But I would encourage you to think about using the user personas to map user roles to end users. You'll see there's suggestions in the user personas of what kinds of user roles different people could be given to do their tasks within CTIS. You can also then use them to create tailored training plans for different kinds of end users. So for example, a study coordinator who does the end-to-end process of regulatory submission is going to need to review quite a few modules to get prepared for CTIS in the CTIS training module program. Whereas someone with a more narrow role, like for example, a safety specialist, may need to have a more narrow training plan. So it can help you to start reflecting on that. And there are also some suggestions of the different kinds of activities different people will cover in CTIS. You can also then use them to help you tell stories in your training and to think about how different people are going to interact with the CTIS processes. Next slide, please. Then we move on to the CTIS sponsor organization modeling, which is a relatively new activity that I want to update you on today. Next slide. So organization modeling, I think we've already heard from some of the speakers today. That's quite an important part of CTIS preparation, is to start to think about how you need to adapt your processes in order to work with CTIS, or exactly who needs to access CTIS to do what, and also potentially how you can work with your partners, for example, with CROs, for inputting information into CTIS. So in collaboration with sponsor representatives, EMA has created a Principles for Sponsor Organization Modeling document. And that means that it essentially covers key principles around access to CTIS, user roles and responsibilities for different kinds of clinical trials, and where different organizations are engaged, for example, sponsors and CROs and academic sponsors and commercial sponsors. So if we go to the next slide then. Here is just one example of an organization model within CTIS, and I'll break this down for you a little bit. This is a fairly typical, I would say, commercial clinical trial where there may be a single sponsor who works with CROs to do their Part 2 submissions or country-specific submissions. And you'll even see with CRO2 there may be CROs that work in particular regions and subcontract then to other CROs that do particular countries within their region. So the question is, well, how can all of these organizations make sure that the inputs on the regulatory submissions get into CTIS? This is just one example of how it could work, where, for example, the sponsor has a centralized submission team that creates the clinical trial, fills out Part 1 and potentially even Part 2 for particular countries. Then also the first 2 CROs may log in directly into CTIS with a more limited role of just preparing Part 2 for particular countries, and therefore have a limited CTIS user role of Part 2 preparer. And then in the case of the subcontracting, where CRO2 works with CRO3 and 4, it may be the case that CRO3 and 4 do not actually go into CTIS themselves. They just give their inputs to CRO2, which then logs in to do the CTIS submissions. And if we go to the next slide, then there's an example of an academic organization model. Here again is what could be quite a typical setup for an academic clinical trial, where there's an academic sponsor who may be responsible for preparing Part 1 or parts of Part 1. They may also then work with a commercial sponsor to provide the IMPDQ. And the question that also always comes up is, would the commercial sponsor need to actually log into CTIS themselves, Or is it better to do a cross-referencing to an IMPDQ in an existing trial? And of course, both are possible in CTIS, and it will just depend on how the academic sponsor and the commercial sponsor prefer to organize. Then there could also be CROs, so an academic CRO or an in-country specific CRO working for the academic sponsor and potentially logging into CTIS to just do their specific tasks in CTIS. And again, they could potentially have more limited user roles to do those tasks. So as mentioned, I would encourage you again to go and look at this document that has been prepared on the CTIS website to get some ideas of how you can organize within CTIS. And again, it links back to the user personas. So who in my organization will be doing these tasks, what roles will they need, and then also the wider context of how we can then interact with our CROs or commercial sponsors if you're an academic sponsor. Next slide, please. Another aspect that is covered by the organization modeling document is some key principles or key considerations when thinking about organizing for CTIS. So again, some have maybe been mentioned or touched upon by previous speakers today. But one key aspect is access to CTIS. So there is, let's say, two ways to decide to organize, where you can, of course, assign user roles to your CROs or other partners like co-sponsors within CTIS, and then those people within those organizations log into CTIS directly to put in, the documents and data they have been working on. Or there's also the potential to delegate CTIS submission only to some people. So, for example, a sponsor may completely retain control of CTIS, or they may also delegate to one CRO to manage CTIS. So you can think about what way might be best for you and for your clinical trials. Centralized and decentralized approach. So again, you can decide either to have a small group or one person responsible for CTIS in your own organization, for example, or having multiple people within different teams adding their contributions. There can be pros and cons to both approach, which are covered in detail in the document. And then I think Andrea mentioned this very well earlier, data sharing. So understanding what each role can view within CTIS, so you know what kind of access you're giving when you're assigning those user roles. So just some key points to reflect on. I think then I'm at the end of my presentation. So I thank you and I look forward to the Q&A session.
Thanks very much, Sarah. And thanks for sticking to time also. In fact, we're making quite good time now. I now hand over to Laura Pioppo, who's Scientific Administrator and CTS expert at the European Medicines Agency. Laura is a qualified pharmacist, joined the EMA in 2009, working initially in compliance and inspection, where she coordinated GCP and pharmacovigilance inspections requested by the CHMP. And since 2017, Laura has been working intensively on the development of the Clinical Trials Information System. I hand over to you, Laura, and you're going to tell us about the overview of Ctis data protection aspects and publication rules. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you very much, Peter, for the kind introduction, and good morning, everyone. So yes, indeed, now we will move more into the description of the high-level functionalities of the system. In this presentation, we will cover also aspects related to data protection and the publication rules of CTIS. Can we go to the next one, please? And next. Thanks. So as we know, CTIS will become the single entry point for the submission and supervision of clinical trials data in the EU and the EA, and the system includes the EU portal and the EU database that have been built in accordance with the requirements of Article 80 and 81 of the regulation, and in addition also includes the safety module for the submission of the annual safety reports. In the system, there will be two secure domain to workspaces accessible to the authority users and the sponsor users. To the authority users is to perform all the activities related to the assessment, the authorization, and the overview of clinical trials. And for the sponsor users, of course, is to perform all the steps related to the preparation and compilation of clinical trials data for an initial application, all the subsequent modification, and really follow all the steps of a clinical trial life cycle, including the submission of the summary of results. Can we go to the next one, please? Thank you. In this slide, we can really see the actors who will be able to access the system and what these users can do in their domain. So at the top, you can see sponsor users. Of course, this will include industry as well as SME and academia and marketing authorization applicants having access to the sponsor workspace. Maybe we can also clarify, because there were some questions on the chat, that CRO users will also have access to the sponsor workspace. Of course, they can perform activities in the system depending on the profile that has been assigned to them. So there is no separate domain for CRO users. They will have access to the sponsor workspace. Then they will populate the data. There will be the submission through the portal to the database, and the information will be stored in the EU database itself. Then we have the authority users, including users of the member states, so national competent authorities and ethics committee, as well as the European Commission and the agency. You can see all these users having access to the secure domain will need a set of credentials. So they will need a username and a password to be able to access the secure domain and perform their activities. Then on the right-hand side, we have the general public, and the fact that the database is accessible to the general public, because this is in line with the requirements of the regulation. And to have access to the public domain, there will be no need to have a set of credentials, will be an open access to the general public. Can we go to the next one, please? Thank you. In these slides, you can see, of course, the Ctis and the various components at the center, including the EU portal, the database, the public website, and the ASR repository. But what we really wanted to emphasize with this slide is the fact that Ctis consumes data from existing database that we use at the EMA. And this is particularly important to emphasize the fact that organization details that are included in Ctis for sponsor, CRO, or even clinical investigator sites are retrieved from the OMS database, from the Organization Management Service database that is already live and has been used by the agency in the last few years. Also, product-related information are extracted from the existing database that is the XCVMPD, and this is applicable to authorized medicinal product as well as development products. So it's a prerequisite that product details will need to be entered in XCVMPD before they can be used to populate a clinical trial application in Ctis. And also to mention in this slide the use of IAM, so the user registration. Of course, if a user has already a profile and a set of credentials that is used to access SPORE or even UDRA-link, you will be able to use this set of credentials to access Ctis. You will not need a new set of credentials for the user. Can we go to the next one, please? This is a quite colorful and busy slide. Maybe we will not go through all the points in the interest of time, but it's really to represent visually what sponsor user can perform into the system and what member states user can also perform into Ctis. So the sponsors, of course, will be able to complete their clinical trial application package, including Part 1 and Part 2 documents in Ctis. They will be able to reply to the request for information, so provide responses to the request for information. Thank you. As well as modification after the initial application has been authorized. And then there is a set of notifications like start of trials, start of recruitment. We have heard about serious breaches. They will all need to be reported via Ctis, as well as the submission of summary of results. On the right-hand side, instead, we can see what member states can do. And of course, we will have the first step, that is the appointment of the RMS, so the reporting member states. So the member states will be able to express their willingness or unwillingness to be the RMS, and then perform all the steps of the evaluation. So document validation outcome, document conclusion outcome, produce an assessment report for part 1, an assessment report for part 2, the decision, that is a national decision, as Christophe mentioned at the beginning, and of course also information on inspections. This is all captured in the system and is all subject to publication rules. Just to mention at the top that we will have also users from the European Commission submitting union control reports and applicants of marketing authorization that have the obligation to submit clinical study reports. And then, of course, we have the general public having access to the public interface and the EMA that is responsible for the system maintenance. Next one, please. Now for the data protection, just to mention that personal data in the system should really be kept to the minimum, and this is in line with the requirements of the regulation. However, the protection of the personal data that will be captured into Ctis is really a joint responsibility of all the users. So this will include the EMA, the European Commission, the member states, and of course the organization, commercial, non-commercial, academia, acting as sponsors or as marketing authorization holders. The requirements of the GDPR and the UDPR will have to be followed, and to crystallize the principle of this concept of being joint controllers, we have developed the so-called JCA joint controllership arrangement that will be published soon in the next few weeks on the public website of the EMA for you to consult. All the users having access to Ctis for the very first time, they will be reminded of their obligation to comply with the principles of the JCA. Next one, please. This is just a reference from the legal text to the Article 81.4, that is really the article of the regulation defining the principle of transparency and publication of data, because the EU database shall be publicly accessible unless the exemption mentioned in the same article would apply. And this is to protect personal data, to protect commercially confidential information, protection of all the communication between the member states, so draft assessment report will not be disclosed to the public, and protection of the supervision activities, such as planning of an inspection, of planning of union controls. These will also be exempted from publication rules, and only the final reports will be published. Now moving to the next one. More on the system functionality. This is just to give you a flavor of the functionality that we have implemented in Ctis that will enable the protection of personal data or other elements like CCI by having two versions of documents, one for publication and one not for publication. In this case, a cover letter, if a signature is required or name are provided, this can be included in the version not for publication. And then, of course, the content will have to be redacted in the version or anonymized in the version that will go into the public domain. This functionality is implemented almost for all the documents into the system that are subject to publication rules. Can we go to the next one, please? For documents such as all the quality related documentation like the IMPDQ or assessment report on the quality part, we have a functionality that clearly explains to the users that in order to protect CCI, this document will not be publicly accessible. So you can see the red text that is displayed here informing the users on the fact that this document will not be subject to publication rules. Next one, please. Thank you. So just to mention on the timelines and how the publication will occur, please consider that if an application is under evaluation and still the member states are considering and they have not yet issued a decision, these data will not go in the public domain. So only application on which a decision, and please consider that this can be any decision, positive or negative, as soon as a decision has been reached, then the data and the documents will be public. The publication will apply to almost all the documents with few exceptions, and the default is always to public at the first opportunity. That is the time of the decision. However, the sponsor have the possibility to defer the timing for the publication of data and documents, and they will have the possibility to make a proposal for deferral timelines that will have then to be evaluated by the member states. As Julien was mentioning in the first presentation, we have different categories of trials with different publication rules, and of course early development trials like phase 4 trials, so first in human, will have a longer time for deferring the publication of data and documents, and we have then less for category 2 trials that are the phase 2 and 3, and even less for category 3 that are the phase 4 trials. This is all described in the detail in the appendix on disclosure rules that is published on the EMA website. Can we go to the next one, please? Also, in the interest of time, we will not go through all the possible scenarios, but this is really a tabular visual representation for you to see what you can defer from publication for depending on the trial type. So you can see the difference between category 1 trials, category 2 and 3, and the maximum proposed timelines being 7 years for category 1 trials, 5 years from the end of the trial in the EU for category 2 trials, and the publication of summary of results for category 3. Next one, please. This is another screenshot taken from the system to show you how the deferral looks like in CTIS. This is a category 1 trial for which the sponsor is proposing to delay the publication of protocol, IMPD, sponsor responses up to 7 years from the end of the trial in the EU EA, and also is applying to defer the publication of the main characteristics. The main characteristics that you can see at the top are really the high level, the main information on the trial, such as the primary endpoints, secondary endpoints, inclusion and exclusion criteria, even the trial title and the product details will fall under the main characteristics. But please consider that this would only be possible for category 1 trials. For category 2 and 3, it's only possible to delay the publication of documents and the responses to the RFI. Can we go to the next one? This we mentioned already, so we don't need to go through on the main characteristics, so we can move to the next one, please. Just to say that regardless if a deferral has been requested and applied or not, there is always a set of data and document that will go in the public domain. This will always be published regardless if there is a deferral. So in the public domain, we will have always the details of the UCT number, the sponsor details, the name and address, the nature of the trial, and then details on the notification, start of trial, start of recruitment, end of the trial, the details of the PI, of the principal investigator, and the suitability of the facility. So this information would always be available and regardless of the trial category. And in the last slide, I think we list what will never go into the public domain and will be exempted from publication rules. So as I mentioned before, quality information, RFI, request for information related to quality, assessment report related to quality, any personal data of member states experts, sponsor staff, and applicant should be redacted and in the slot for publication, and of course financial arrangement between the sponsor and the site. And the next one, please, I think is the thank you slide. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Laura, and thanks to Anna, Sarah and Laura for clear presentations and for sticking to time.
Welcome back to everybody. We will now start session 3, which is titled The New Process for Submitting Clinical Trials information in the EU EEA. And we'll have a joint presentation for the first part by Maria Elgaard Sorensen and Rudiger Bankau. So I will start with Maria. Maria is a special advisor and project manager at the Danish Medicines Agency, and she holds a Master of Science in pharmacy, and she has been working as an assessor of clinical trials applications for several years. From 2016, she's been engaging in the CTIS project, and currently as MSPO and master trainer. Maria has been appointed business specialist at the Danish agency in both the European and Danish IT solutions for handling clinical trials and other systems with interaction to clinical trials area. Rudiger is a molecular biologist and principal consultant regulatory affairs at Parexel, where he has a long-term experience as a CRO in global clinical trials, management and regulatory consulting. He also represents ACRO for the EU Scientific and Regulatory Committee, and has been continuously involved since 2016 in various European Medicines Agency stakeholder activities for the CTIS development. I will now give the floor to Maria and Rudiger for this joint presentation. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much for those kind words. And I will start by saying, yes, we have definitely joined forces today and trying to ensure that you will get both the authority perspective and the sponsor perspective from the experience we have gained from testing the system. If you go to the next slide. Yes, thank you. I will start by underlining that this material that we are presenting for you today, it's not new material. It has been developed for the purpose of the sponsor master trainers training sessions, and you will also see much of it reflected in the module 19 of the training material that is published on the EMA website. And also to emphasize that Fia will come back to this about the training material much more later on. If you go to the next slide, you can see that we will try to cover today the entire life cycle of the clinical trial in the CTIS and the entire data flow. And goes without saying that Peter is a tight manager of time today, so we will not be able to go into a lot of detail. But we will try to have our focus on the practical implications of the changes introduced with the CTR, and especially with the use of the CTIS system. If you go to the next slide, you can see that, and the next one, thank you, that what is the biggest change with the CTR and the use of the CTIS system, that everything, every duty related to a CT application, a CT in the EU, has to be performed within this system. And it goes from the very beginning of managing users, workload functionalities within the system, from the very first application of a new clinical trial, including all communication with authorities. So from the first submission, when you get RFIs by raised considerations by the authorities inserted into RFIs, request for information you need to respond to, and there on through all the various notifications you have to submit, and to the annual safety reporting, and to the very end with the submission of the clinical trial summary of results and reporting. If you go to the next slide. Thank you. What has already been mentioned very explicitly by both Sarah and Anna, the most important thing here is also that all actors engaged in the system need to have appropriate roles assigned. And the most important here, we must emphasize, is the CT admin. And it goes without saying also from the various presentations until now that regardless what model you're choosing, the CT admin user role is the most important. And that one can actually do the first creation of a clinical trial and can also assign roles to other users when possible, or when relevant, of course. If, for instance, I saw there was a question in the slide, in the chat also about this, if you want to delegate, for instance, the part 2 preparation to another user more close to the site, you could say, then that is a possibility to do so. But if, for instance, as Anna also mentioned, that a sponsor organization does not already have a sponsor admin, then any user can in principle create a new clinical trial in that organization name as a sponsor. And now I will give the floor to Rudiger, who will take you through the various applications and the submissions to the system.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you everyone also for allowing me the continuation here on this webinar for today. So if I can have the next slide, please. So when we speak about the Cta dossier on our initial application and all subsequent applications that we may then submit as part of a clinical trial authorization, we see several sections that are populated by the sponsor and will allow the sponsor to provide some general information in a form section. The member states concerned that participate in the clinical trial or are envisaged to participate, a common part 1 that is populated, the member state specifics parts 2, which then form basically our dossier part. And then once a dossier is submitted and evaluated, decided, there is an evaluation page for which the information, which basically means the correspondence between the sponsor and the member states on the evaluation, are exchanged and documented on that evaluation page. And finally, there is a page that shows the projected and the timelines that are applicable to that specific application evaluation in relation to the different phases of the application evaluation up until the point of a decision. Next slide, please. While we have the information populated by the sponsor in our application, we need to note, and it has already been mentioned a couple of times today before, that some information is actually derived in our application dossier from source databases. Just to mention that from the OMS, the Organization Management System, we as sponsors need to populate the information related to the sponsor, any co-sponsor or legal representative, third parties, as well as the trial sites. I just want to mention here, because the information is also provided in relation to the location, that it is important for sponsors to not only register the organization, but also register the different locations where they apply, because all information is populated into our clinical trial application dossier and needs to be derived from the external records that are registered within OMS. It is a possibility that sponsors can populate trial site information at the time of creating the application dossier, for which then the information is then pushed through to the OMS stewards and the OMS validation. So this information also exists for specific for the trial sites. If I can have the next slide, please. The same information from registered OMS record also applies for the products. And products, any role of a product taking in the clinical trial application dossier, the test investigational medicinal product, any comparator or reference investigational medicinal product, as well as auxiliary medicinal products, need to be registered, including if any of these products in the investigational medicinal products relate to a placebo. The only exception for a placebo is that there is a possibility to manually populate that information directly in our application dossier. So for placebos, there exists an option to not having to first create an external XEVMPD record. However, when we speak about XEVMPD records, we need to notice again that this applies to any product regardless of its marketing authorization status in the European Economic Area. Therefore, if a product does not have a marketing authorization in the European Economic Area, for instance, even comparators that may be used from exceptionally and were justified from non-EEA third countries, need to be created as an XCV-MPD record by the organization, by the company, before they can be populated into the clinical trial application dossier. Next slide, please. When sponsors create the application for a multinational clinical trial, they have the obligation and they have the possibility to propose a reporting member state, who is then the reporting member state for the communication and correspondence on the evaluation for part 1. Member states have up to 6 days then to decide whether or not they agree and confirm their proposed reporting member state that was proposed by the sponsor, or whether a different reporting member state will be assigned by the participating member states concerned. An additional application can be submitted either as a full dossier, which means that for a country we submit under the Article 5, the Part 1 plus the corresponding Part 2, but there's also the option that there is a split between Part 1 and for a specific country, the Part 2 under the Article 11, where then after the initial Part 1 conclusion, sponsors have up to 2 years to submit the pending Part 2 for the remaining countries or the member states concerned. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. When the application has been submitted and is under evaluation, member states may raise requests for information to the sponsor, either depending on the responsibility for Part 1 and or Part 2 via the reporting member states, or the member states concerned, each individually for their corresponding parts that they are responsible for. When an RFI requires that the dossier needs to be updated, it is possible for the sponsor to create a new draft and submit the updated draft along the RFI response. Timelines need to be adhered to, otherwise, from a sponsor perspective, the application will be deemed lapsed. And the next slide, please. What are these timelines? These timelines are Central European timelines. They relate to a specific regulation that was published in 1971. And just very briefly, timelines start with 1 second after midnight. They end one second before midnight. On the due dates, they can, from the sponsor perspective, never fall on a non-working day, which means not on Saturdays and Sundays. And independent of the RFIs that will be or have been raised by the member states in relation to an application evaluation, the extension of the evaluation timelines only extend once. They are not extended by each of the RFIs that may exceptionally apply. And again, just to reiterate, if sponsors do not adhere with the timelines on the RFI responses, their application will be deemed lapsed. Next slide, please. How do we update our initial clinical trial application dossier? What are the application types that we follow on then subsequently? And on the next slide, please, we will introduce to you the different scenarios of the functionalities that we update on our initial application. The first is, can I have the slides advanced? Yes, thank you. On the substantial modification. A substantial modification is a change that is provided under Article 2 with the definition that has been provided, but is also a change that is provided under Article 15, for instance, in Part 2, an addition of a new clinical trial site or a change of an investigator, principal investigator. There are other situations where this will also be applicable. For instance, as we already know from today, the change of a halted trial into a restarted trial. Other situations are shown on this slide, which also show that it is important for the system to have new baseline calculation dates. Otherwise, a specific situation and authorization may expire or end, and the system needs to have new baseline data created as structured data. The next slide, please. Non-substantial modifications under the EU clinical trial regulation are two ways. There are those that are falling under Article 81.9, for which we as sponsors will choose a specific submission pathway, which is the non-substantial modification pathway. Those are the changes that are relevant for the supervision by the member states concerned and will need to be submitted in a timely manner as they relate to updates that are relevant for member states concerned to know in a timely fashion and not only to be included at the next opportunity, while the other ones that are not relevant for the supervision can, as we currently know from the directive, be submitted at the next opportunity, for instance, the submission of a substantial modification, where those changes will be included and indicated in the cover letter and correspondingly submitted along. Next slide, please. When we add an additional member state concerned that has not been included in our initial scope of the member states concerned for our initial application, sponsors have the possibility to choose the additional member state application functionality, which follows the principle according to Article 14. And I just would like to mention here that this inclusion is not only limited to new member states concerned that have not existed, but also if the prior notification and submission of an initial application for a member state concerned or an additional member state concerned application has been lapsed or withdrawn or not authorized. This is also the possibility to re-include them, as well as when the member state application's clinical trial authorization has expired. So this opportunity allows sponsors to re-include also countries. And on the next slide, I would like to show what is the difference between the resubmission. So when we speak about an additional member state concerned and the inclusion of a country that has previously been not authorized, we will choose the functionality of an additional member state application, while only in the case on the business situation when the entire clinical trial has either withdrawn, lapsed, or not authorized in all member states concerned, then sponsors will choose the functionality of a resubmission, which will then increment the last two digits of our clinical trial EUCT number, on which indicates to the member states that this is submitted now as a new clinical trial as part of a resubmission procedure, and the last two digits denote that resubmission specificities. Next slide, please. We leave the applications and now move on to the notifications. So sponsors have the obligation to report specific events, situations, circumstances, either that are foreseen, for instance, the trial and recruitment periods that usually apply to the life cycle of a clinical trial, as well as those that may circumstantially apply, basically situation specific, such as unexpected events, serious breaches, urgent safety measures, or third country inspection reports for which we cannot give any prediction, and they need to be submitted along as they situation specific appear. I would like on the next slide show you some principles of the trial and recruitment periods. So although this on this slide shows a typical progression pathway of the trial life cycle, there needs to be noticed that any of these notifications can actually be made. For instance, if they are circumstantially applied at an end of a trial needs to be notified, for instance, in the case of a premature termination, that this possibility still exists, although the recruitment may not have started, or maybe the end of the recruitment has not yet been given. So there is a possibility that sponsors can intervene as their trial progresses. Also, another option to intervene with their notification schemes is shown on the next slide, which allows sponsors to notify in case a trial is temporarily halted. Temporary halted of the trial allows, as of today, for reasons of subject safety and or not, immediately. The notification implies that the recruitment is stopped with any temporary halt, and when the sponsor has the trial halted under the reasons of subject safety and or risk benefit, there is a need to submit and get authorized a prior substantial modification when the sponsors can then restart the trial and subsequently can also restart the recruitment. Then next slide, please. I would then again like to hand over to Maria for continuation. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Rudiger. And now I will tell you a little about the ad hoc assessments. That is actually a functionality within the system that is for the authorities only. And this is a functionality that enables the member states to do an alignment of a specific issue, communicate with each other to ensure that we have a harmonized approach. When needed. For instance, if we see a concern that is related to one of the notifications that Rudiger just mentioned that has been submitted, it can be an issue about a temporary hold, or it could be a premature end of a clinical trial that creates a concern among the member states where they need to align and consider what to do about it. And more importantly, because why is this important for you to know something about? That is that this ad hoc assessment where we do a communication, it may even be across several clinical trials. If it is a safety issue for a specific IMP, then this may result in an RFI that is submitted to you. And again, here it is very important to emphasize that the system does not create any email notification to alert you about this. You need to monitor the notifications and alert tabs or your RFI tab as well to ensure that you see if you get these notifications. So when you have ongoing clinical trials, make sure that you monitor carefully and see whether you get any request for information from the member states concerned. And a little bit in addition to that, I wish, however, to also emphasize that we still have phones. So should you have any concern on your side, and if we have a very big concern, I bet that we will also be able to pick up the phone once in a while. And if you go to the next slide, I would just like to also come to the fact that if we have grounds on a member state on the authority side, according to Article 77 of the regulation, we may take more a drastic approach, and that would be the corrective measures. This is where if we find it necessary, if we are very concerned, we see that there is a very serious breach going on somewhere, then we can do the intended corrective measure, you could say, where we actually ask you to do, and we will require you to do a modification of a trial or suspend the trial or revoke the authorization even. In most patient occasions, this will be started by an intention to do so. And that will again initiate the request for opinion on your side. So sort of a hearing, you could say, before we go to the very drastic corrective measure. But we do have the possibility to go directly to the corrective measure if we see fit. So if we see a very serious patient concern here, then we may go directly to the corrective measure and stop the trial. However, going to the next slide, going to the fact where we actually have a more happy ending, you do the clinical trial without any premature ends or any other major concerns, then you need to do the submission of the results also to the CTIS. And what is new here is that you need also to be aware that if you have planned for intermediate data analysis, then they also need to be submitted to the CTIS. And for the summary of results, we know them already. They need to be submitted, but now they also need to be accompanied by a layperson's summary of results in the spirit of the regulation to ensure that also the public will be able to understand the results of the clinical trial. The very end, the happy ending, you go to marketing authorization, and in that case, also the clinical study reports need to be submitted. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. We will now move to a demonstration of the CTIS functionalities. And this will be done by Haralambos Drosos. Haralambos is a change management officer for the CTIS at EMA, and he's responsible for various training-related activities, including sponsor and member states master trainers and training material production. Haralambos has previous experience in ERP and CRM implementation projects, in activities related to UAT testing, process creation, and user training. Prior to joining EMA, Haralambos worked as a business analyst in the chemicals and electronics industries. Haralambos, I give you the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So, good morning to everybody. My name is Haralambos Drosos. I'm a member of the CTIS Change Management team. And today I will be explaining to you some basic functionalities in CTIS in the sponsor workspace. I will use my credentials to log into the sponsor workspace. And I will land in by default to this clinical trial tab here on top. The green line indicates in which tab I'm currently in. And from this tab, I can use the search functionalities below, and I can retrieve any clinical trial for which I have been given any role. If I don't have a role for a clinical trial, I cannot retrieve that. Besides the clinical trial tab on top, you may see some additional tabs on the right side. And once you will log into your account, you will be able to see few of them or even all of them, depending on which roles have been assigned to you. Before we go to the clinical trials tab, let's stay for one moment in the notice and alerts tab. This is a quite important tab for everybody. Every user with minimum permissions will be having this tab here. And over there, you will be receiving notices and alerts for related to clinical trials for which you have been given a role. Notices are mostly informative messages, and they inform you for events that have happened to your clinical trials. Alerts, this might be a call to you or to other users with similar permissions to take specific action on a specific clinical trial. Going back now to the clinical trials tab, as you can see on top, I have the basic search. If I happen to have the clinical trial number, I can insert it and retrieve it immediately. I can also use one of the two trial advanced searches or application advanced searches, like one of the two advanced searches below. And if I'm not sure for the clinical trial number, or if I need to retrieve multiple clinical trials that satisfy the selected criteria, then I will use one of those advanced searches. And I will expand one of them, and you can see that each one of them has multiple search criteria, and you can use them accordingly. I'm not going to, by the way, also here something that I need to mention is that whenever you hover your mouse over its search criterion, you can see these black callouts, and this is a short description of each criterion. I'm not going to perform any advanced search. I will use directly the basic advanced search. I will insert a clinical trial number, click on the search button, and in the end of the page, after each time I perform a search, I will retrieve my search results. Of course, now I have one result only, and you can see already some basic information. Besides the clinical trial number, you can see the trials, the title of the trial, the status with this colored label, and on the right side, some additional information regarding the reporting member state, the other member state concerned, the medical condition, and more information. I will open the clinical trial now, and I will land in the page of the clinical trial. By default, I will land in this summary subtab here. There are like more subtabs, and we will see them in a while. In this summary subtab, you can find some essential information for the clinical trial. We start with some basic trial information on top. You can see the sponsor, the trial phase, the therapeutic area, some additional information again for the medical condition, the population type. And moving down below, you can see also a section with the investigational medicinal products. You can see that I have that two products have been used for this clinical trial, and you can even expand the tiles here, and you can see some additional information for each one of them. Scrolling down now, we have another subsection for the trial status in each one of the member state concerned. So you can see that in 3 countries the trial has been authorized, and in 1 country, the 4th, the trial is still under evaluation. You will find also here on the right side some important milestones for each member state concerned, such as when was the date for the first decision, and also when the trial started or when the trial finished. In the last section, in the last subsection of this page, you will see a list of all the applications and non-substantial modifications. So besides the initial application that you can see always in the end of this list, and it is indicated either by the type or by the ID here, the initials, you might be having many applications of different types, either additional member state concern or substantial modification. You can see some basic information regarding its application. Again, the member state concern, the related part, submission date, and also for the substantial modification, you can use the plus icons here and view the reason and the scope. Again, if there was any non-substantial modification, it would have been listed here in the same area, okay, as it is indicated by the label of this, by the title of this subsection. Scrolling up now, let's have a look at the other subtabs. So in the second one, fuel trial information. If you click on that, you will be able to retrieve any relevant information for this clinical trial. You can see here on the right side the 4 sections that comprise the dossier of the clinical trial application. It's the form, member state concern, part 1. Each one of them has subsections and tiles, and you can, if you expand them, you will see either structured data or placeholders for documents. For part 2, actually, we will be having multiple subsections, as many as the number of the member state concerned. Again, here you can use this filter and select one of the member state concerned, and you can actually filter the information and keep only those that have been submitted to the selected member state. Again, here, as I said, if you expand the tiles here, you will see either structured data. For example, here you will see the structured data for the trial site, but also you will see placeholders for documents. And if you scroll down to the very last section, you will see also all the documents listed. I need to scroll to the right, and you will see here also like a label. You can use them and download the relevant document. Moving to the next subsection, we will go to the notifications. This is a very important subtab for every sponsor user, especially after the authorization of your clinical trial. Here in this working area, you will be able to submit notifications related to trial and recruitment periods. And you can see here a number of buttons. Again, if you hover your mouse over the button, you will see a call out with a short description. And you can use those buttons to submit a notification for the start of your trial, or here, the start of the recruitment, and or restart of the recruitment. Again, as it concerns the trial, you have additional ones for temporary hold of the trial, to restart your trial, and to end it. Actually, I didn't follow the order of the buttons on the system. I followed the life cycle, the typical life cycle of a clinical trial. And whenever you tick one of the boxes next to the country, you will activate some of the buttons. And by clicking on the button, you will need to populate some information regarding this notification and submit it. which button now will be activated depends on what you had submitted previously. Scrolling down to the same subtab, you will see also some additional working areas in which you will be able to submit notifications related to unexpected events. Again, as you see, the call out that describes the type of the notification. You will be able also to submit serious breaches, urgent safety measure, and third country inspectorate inspection. As you can see already, for the unexpected event, we have also some examples. We have one notification that has been submitted, and you can see that either from the status or from the submission date, we have like a second notification that is still in draft. It might be the case that the colleagues are still collecting information, and they have started the notification, they saved it in draft, and they will be able, once they have all the information, to edit it, populate the remaining parts, or upload the necessary documents, and either to submit it or even to cancel it, if it's in draft. I will discard the changes, and moving now ahead to the trial results, another subtab. Here you will be able to upload the summary of results. It might be intermediate or the final summary of results. And also you have another placeholder below in which you will be able to upload the summary of results in lay language. And also there is another placeholder, not placeholder, there is another subsection for the clinical study reports. This is not the working area to upload your clinical study reports, your CSRs. This is the working area here, the tab on top. If you happen to have the appropriate role, you will be able to see that tab, and you will be able also to upload clinical study reports. Once the CSR is uploaded, it will be visible here in this area in view mode. You won't be able to edit it, just to view the details of it. Moving now to the corrective measures. This is the working area in which you will see any corrective measure that might be submitted by the authorities. You can see here, like on this yellow ribbon, a message that it says only submitted corrective measures will be displayed here. And you can see also the details by using this eye icon. And you can see actually that this is a type that requires modification, and here the authorities, they will explain, they will describe the reason, the justification, the reason that they submitted that unexpected event, and also what they ask from you. Next, the ad hoc assessment here. Also here is the working area in which you will be having visibility to ad hoc assessments submitted by the authorities, in case there is an RFI that has been submitted to you, and this RFI is related to this ad hoc assessment. Last subtab is for the users. This provides you with an overview of all the roles related to this clinical trial that have been assigned to users. Here it's not very easy to understand that, because my colleagues and I are using some dummy accounts, and all of them have the same first name and last name, but each one of those rows corresponds to one user. So you can see that in the first row, 4 roles have been assigned to this user. This actually happens to be the user that I'm currently using for this demo. If we go to the second row, you will see 2 roles have been assigned to my colleague. 2 colleagues have been assigned also to a third colleague. And also there is another one colleague that has received only 1 role for this clinical trial. Then we can also actually open off one clinical trial that is in draft and see also the dossier and how you can populate the different information there. So I will click on the clinical trials tab. Here, as you remember, it's the place that allows you to retrieve any clinical trial for which you have been given a role. But actually also you can use the button and create a new clinical trial. If I click on that, before I am able to create my draft for a new clinical trial, I need to populate 2 fields, the title and also the sponsor. the sponsor here retrieves data from OMS. So in order to activate the button, I need to populate either the name or the ID, one of the two. As soon as I perform my search, if I find my results here, I will select them and I will be able to create the draft. If I don't find the results, if I don't find my organization here, then I will be able to use this button and create and submit actually a request to create a new organization. This request will go to the OMS team for validation and approval, but in the meantime, I will be able to use that temporary entry, let's say, and submit my clinical trial application. But please make sure that you provide all the information in your request. Otherwise, your request might get rejected, and then you will be having some issues during the evaluation of your clinical trial. The positive thing is that you don't have to wait for the final approval. You can proceed with your clinical trial application submission. Something also that my colleagues referred previously, and it will happen a lot during the first months of the after go live period. In case you need to create now, in case you need actually to populate to the system a transition trial, you need to create a new trial, and please use that ticking box, and you will indicate that this trial is a transition trial. Of course, if it's not, don't use it. Now I will open a clinical trial that is in draft. So we will see most of the parts already populated. I will open the clinical trial. I will scroll down and I will open the initial application. So here we have the dossier, and you can see already you can see the first four sections are for the dossier of the clinical trial application. You can see here that there are like some sections with a padlock. I will try to use the magnifying glass, and you will see here that this padlock now seems to be unlocked. So if I need to access that subsection and start populating information or editing the existing ones, I need to lock the area. And now I can actually open this. Tile and start changing the title. Any time that I use the padlock to lock a specific subsection and work on it, I prevent other users from accessing that same section and making changes. It will be only me who will be able to make any changes. I will make it again available to other users as soon as I unlock the area. Let's go to the form and let's go have a quick look on all the subsections. So the form here has 4 different subsections. As I said, if I lock one of them, no one else can use the same section, but they will be able to use the other sections in the same page that remain unlocked. Okay, so if I use here the form details, if I lock this area initial application details, my colleagues will be able to work on the proof of payment of PFI, the second one, or like the compliance with regulation. In the first one, you will need to upload. You will need actually to use this placeholder and upload the cover letter, a document. Below, it's not mandatory. If it's required by the authorities, you will find as many placeholders as the number of the member state concerned, and you will be able to upload for each country the proof of payment. Below, there is a very new subsection. It was added like quite recently, and this is related to the compliance of the sponsor with the regulation regarding the data protection. And in the end, also there is another subsection, and you, according to the category that you will use, I'll open it. According to the category that you will be using, you will be able to select here some deferral rules. If there is any particular reason for which you want to request a delay of the publication of specific information, this is the place to do it. And you can apply some deferral rules if there is specific justification for that. Scrolling down now, scrolling up, going to the next section, I will open the member state concern. As you can understand here, and I will open the area. You can add member state concern for this clinical trial. You can indicate also the number of the subjects for each country, and also the sponsor needs to propose one country to be the RMS, the reporting member state. The final decision which country will be the RMS is taken by the authorities, not by you. The sponsor just propose an RMS. They do not decide. In the end also, you will be having in view mode third countries that might be participating in this clinical trial, and also the number of the subjects. Those are not, the details for the third countries are not populated here. They are populated in part 1. But of course, here you have you can see them in view mode, not to edit them. Then in part 1, there are 3 main subsections, as you can see. The first one is for the trial details, and here you will see many tiles that include either structured data or placeholders for documents. You saw previously like the title, but of course also you will see here the tile for the protocol information and other tiles for other type of information. Scrolling down here, you will find the subsection that is dedicated to the sponsor details. So if you open that, you will be able to add the contact details also to, you can see here the details and the fields, editable, and also you will be able to add details for the scientific contact point, for the public contact point. You see the button here. Always, if you want to add contact points, you need to click on this gray ribbon that includes the sponsor details, and then this button add contacts will appear. So you can add contacts regarding this sponsor. From here, you see, I have already populated scientific and public contact points. You can also add, and always you see the call out when you hover your mouse over its category of contact points. You will be able to add legal representative if the sponsor happens to be located in third country. Also, you can add the third parties in case the sponsor allocates workload to CROs, for example. Scrolling down, also, you have a subsection for the products. As you can see here, if I open that, first of all, you will need to add a role, and we have added here in this case 3 different roles, one for comparator, one for test, one for placebo. And if you expand here the role, you will be able to add 1 or more products, and you will see here the details. Besides the structured data for each product, you will need also to upload documents to their dedicated placeholders. So you will need to upload the IMPD quality document, also the investigator's brochure. In the very end also, you will be having the content labeling, and this will be a document which you can associate it with multiple products, actually multiple roles, not just products. You can see here like that I have all the roles that I have already populated linked here to this document. Then, of course, like in the end, you have an overview of all the documents that have been uploaded. So you see all those documents have been uploaded on the placeholders that can be found in the various tiles that I showed you previously. In the part 2, again, here you have, and as you can see, you have 2 subsections because I have actually 2 member state concerned, one for Germany and one for Greece. On top, you will see the trial sites, and you can see here the details of the investigational site. Again, if I click on the button here, excuse me, if I click on the button here, you will see the same search functionality, which allows me to retrieve data from the OMS. As I explained previously, if you don't find your organization, either you are looking for the sponsor or for a site or anything else, if you don't find your organization, you will be able to submit a request to create a new organization, and you don't have to wait for the validation. You can just use this temporary entry and go ahead with your work. And of course, besides the structured data, we have also various placeholders for the documents, as you can see here in the tiles below: recruitment arrangements, subject, and more. And of course, as always, for part 1 and part 2, in the very end, you have this tile that includes all the documents of this section. Last, we will go also very quickly to the evaluation tab. So here is not so visible, but as soon as you submit your application, you will be able also to monitor the process of the evaluation here. You can see that the evaluation has different phases. The first one is the validation, assessment part 1 and assessment part 2, and the very end, the decision. Whenever you receive an RFI, the request for information, whenever you receive that, it will be listed here. Now we have 0. Of course, it's still in draft. It has not been submitted. We can open later a clinical trial that is under evaluation. But actually, we can do it now. I will go to the clinical trials tab. I will open the trial. It's under evaluation, as you can see. I will open the application. And I will go to the evaluation tab. So as you can see now, for the validation, we have, if I expand here, the RFI, you can see that an RFI has been received, and actually it has been responded. You see the details of the RFI. Also, if I close that tile, I can also check the conclusion of the RFI, of the validation. It's valid, completed. For all those decisions, you will be informed by the notice and alerts as we explained previously. If it happens that you receive an RFI, also you will receive a relevant notice or alert according to your role. Again, for assessment part 1, you will see also an RFI here. This is due, it has not been responded yet. And here in the conclusion, I don't see any details. There is a pending RFI, and I guess soon I will be able to see here the final conclusion for part 1 assessment. Not sure if we have enough time. If we have 1 or 2 minutes, I would like also to touch and describe a few things about the RFI. Otherwise, we will move with the Q&A.
Yes, go ahead. 2 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So, as I explained, whenever something happens, you will be receiving notice and alerts. But if it's for an RFI, and because this is very important functionality, all your RFIs will be listed in this tab. Of course, you need to have the appropriate roles to have this tab and also receive RFIs. Here you will be receiving different types of RFIs. RFIs related to the evaluation of your applications, or RFIs related to corrective measures, and we call them sponsor's opinion, or RFIs related to ad hoc assessments. You can use the advanced search here, and from the status, select pending. So you keep, instead of all the RFIs, you keep only the pending RFIs. You can even use the sort tools here, and you can prioritize the RFIs that the due date is quite close. So you can prioritize those that they are about to expire. I go here and select sort according to the due date. You see that I will bring on top the one that expires earlier. And by using those simple tools, you can easily organize your workload and respond on RFIs that are to expire. If I click on that, the black letters, now I have been transferred to the evaluation tab. And as you can see here, the working area for this RFI has been expanded. I will need to use the lock button here, lock the area, and start working on that. Here, if I need to make any changes on the application because it is required by the authorities, and you will understand that from the content, I will use that button here, the change application button. Scrolling down, you will find the questions to you as expressed by the authorities. So you will see consideration is like a question. So if you see in the consideration here the text, this is, of course, it's a dummy value, but this is a question towards you. It might be a question regarding some structured data or some documents that information might be missing. It might be everything. But you can see the details of that and you can understand the content. From here, for example, you will see application section parts. This is a consideration related to part 1, and it's about non-clinical aspect. The section that is affected, it's for the product details. It might, and now here the text of the consideration, the authorities might be asking from you to make some correction on a document that has been provided. Same also, there's a second consideration here. Those are questions to you. And in order to be able to submit your response, you will need to add a text here on the field, on the free text field, your response to that consideration. Even if you prefer to use the placeholder, the document, still you need to insert here a value, like indicative value, like full response is included in the attached document. Only then you will be able to save your response and proceed to the next one. And as soon as you have responded to all the considerations, you will be able to submit your response. Those were, like, I mean, with that demo, we just needed, we wanted to show you the main working areas in which you will be using after 2 months from now. And of course, you will be able to find more information in our training catalog. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we'll wrap up the Q&A session for session 3, and I will hand over now to Peter for session 4 on safety reporting in CTIS. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed. So session 4 has 1 star speaker. I'm very pleased to introduce Marianne Lunther from the Agency for Health and Food Safety in Austria. Marianne's a medical doctor, currently working as a safety assessor in the clinical trials department. She's been an alternate member of the clinical trials facilitation group since 2017. Is also a product owner for Ctis. Marianne has also served as a pharmacovigilance assessor prior to her current work in clinical trials, and was an alternate member of the Pharmacovigilance Risk Assessment Committee in the past. So, Marianne, tell us all about safety reporting. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Good afternoon from my side. I will tell you about the future changes in clinical trials, safety reporting, about how to submit the annual safety report via CTIS. I can already, perhaps, yeah, I'm here. Thank you. And about the Member States' cooperation in safety assessment. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. I have to be fast. I think I overdid it a bit with my slides, so we'll be very brief on all of the slides. What is going to be new about clinical trial safety reporting? The clinical trial regulation demands electronic submission of SUSAs and annual safety reports. This will be via into the Eurovigilance database for SUSAs, into the clinical trial department of the Eurovigilance database. This is not so new for you. What is really new is the annual safety reports will go via the CTIS. You will see a lot of details how to really do this later on. The Commission is about to adopt an implementing regulation giving the Member State clear guidance and regulatory framework about how to cooperate in safety assessment. Doing so, we are now officially introducing the concept of safety assessing Member State. This safety assessing Member State will have to assess all the safety relevant data for the host substance. So this will cover different sponsors, different IMPs, dosages, everything, the whole substance related information all in one hand. And by doing so, we are expecting better oversight and hopefully this will lead to a very important increase in subject safety by early detection of potential safety issues. By bundling the whole data, things will be visible earlier. And then there is a communication with member states and sponsors. Everything will be in CTIS, so everything will be traceable and transparent to everyone within sponsor and member states workspaces, because none of the information in relation to patient safety will ever be published. There are different procedures that are in relation to safety assessment. This will be the annual safety report procedure with questions coming to you potentially. Then there is the ad hoc assessment procedure, another procedure that we will use if there are questions coming from SUSE assessment. And then, as indicated already by my previous speakers, there is also a corrective measure. So when member states need to take action in relation to a trial, this is via the corrective measure. The IT support is not yet fully developed, but development is ongoing. And I think we have a good system in place for the beginning, and it will be further improved later on. CTFG is at this point in time working on guidances, developing new ones, adapting the old ones in order to cover the new requirements that are coming up. Next slide, please. A few words only on the transition. I think it's not so relevant for the SMEs, perhaps as much as for the big companies. For the SUSAs, you can already now submit them to the vigilance database, but as long as you have trials under the directive, the old requirements still apply with regard to investigators and ethics committees. For the annual safety reports, a bit of the same. You can immediately report to CTIS. The National Competent Authority reporting requirements will be covered by the submission to CTIS, also with regard to directive trials. But please inform us via the cover letter and name all trials and all member states concerned, because for obvious reasons, it's not possible to indicate this via structured data in the system. So you will have to come up with this information in the cover letter. And again, the reporting requirements to investigators and ethics committees remain as is, as long as you have trials under the directive. Next slide, please. Now, immediately to the system. We have a specific tab on sponsor side for annual safety reporting. When you go there, you have a button to push when you want to submit a new annual safety report. But before doing so, please be aware there is no save button. You have to have all data and documents available before you're starting, because if you are interrupted and you don't have everything in the system, there is no way to save it, and you have to start from scratch. It's not so severe because it's a rather fast process. If you have everything there, you can do it in, let's say, 5 minutes or so. But I recommend to go through the 4-step procedure to see what you need before you're starting, and then collect all the information and documents, and then start from fresh. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. This is a 4-step procedure, and the first step is about sponsor information. So you are via drop-down menu, you can select your affiliation or the sponsor information you need for this annual safety report submission. By doing so, you can activate an auto population of the address fields, and then in the next step, you have to actively open a part where you can insert the contact details for annual safety report submission. There are a lot of mandatory fields, so you should not forget to include information also here in this hidden part of the system, you have to give the name of the annual safety report submitter, and if the submitter is from the same affiliation as before, then you again can indicate this and activate auto-population of a lot of fields. You will have to give a phone number, and the specificity about this is that it has to be without interpunction, otherwise the submission will not work. And then this is already done. Next slide, please. The next step is about clinical trials details. So via a search field, you will be able to search for all the trials in relation to a substance for your organization. So the most relevant field of this advanced search pop-up window will be the active substance field, because your annual safety report submission will most probably be about active substance. There is, or I'm sure you know, under the directive also the possibility to submit annual safety reports per trial. This could also be very relevant for small companies or for non-commercial sponsors especially. So either per active substance or per trial, you will be able to submit your annual safety report. If it's about an active substance, you include this information into the search field. At least 3 letters, otherwise the search does not function. Then, according to your search criteria, you receive a list of trials that could potentially be relevant for your annual safety report submission. Then you have to individually tick all the trials. There is no possibility to select them all at once. And then in a second step, after selecting the trials you want to submit the annual safety report for all the different trials, you will receive a list of products and their roles. And for each of the trials, you're able to select them. Do I want to submit my annual safety report only for the test IMP, or is there also safety relevant information for the comparator or even for the auxiliary medicinal product? And if the last thing is the place, then you are able via another search field to give additional information on which auxiliary medicinal product especially you want to give safety relevant information about. So next slide, please. Here you can give information about the reporting period details. Important to know, there is no technical validation, so please be aware that your dates, you have to control them yourself in order to give appropriate information. Let us know if your reference safety information has changed, and then there is a huge list of what special information you want to point out to us in relation to the submission. This can be your development is an early development program. It could be that there are ATMPs involved. There could have been safety relevant actions taken during the reporting period. Anything else you want to tell us about your submission, or none of the above points apply to your submission, please just let us know. It is also possible to multiple select here. Next slide, please. Then there is the section about the documents. There is only one slot which requires mandatory document insertion, and this is the annual safety report document slot. Something about the file size and the format. All the documents in this annual safety report functionality have a size limit of 10 megabytes, and they all have to be in PDF. For the annual safety report, there is only one document that can be included. For the other slots, you can attach multiple documents. You can specifically put your SMPC or investigator's brochure into the respective slots, and then there is a slot named Other. And here we will request you to include the cover letter, which is specifically important for the transition period, as I pointed out in my previous slide about the transition period. And as I let you know already at the beginning, nothing will ever go public. None of the safety relevant data will ever be published. So this is clearly indicated in the pop-up window. When you're attaching the documents, you will also be highlighted that this is not going to be published ever. And then once you have included the ASR itself, the reference safety information, and all the information you included is complete, accurate, and in line with legal requirements, then you're able to submit. Next slide, please. This slide, I think, is a very relevant one because it shows you what you can find in the RFI tab. I'm focusing on the questions in relation to annual safety report, but the RFI tab is really, I have to emphasize it again. I think my previous speakers already pointed out that this is very important. Here, you will receive questions that you're expecting, but potentially also questions that you're not so much expecting, because the ad hoc assessment and the corrective measures related questions can come out of the blue. But now back to the annual safety reporting. If you select as a source type in this advanced search field in relation to request for information, assess ASR as a source type and as a status pending, then you will receive only pending questions in relation to annual safety report. And then in a second step, you can sort it by due date. So I think you will receive a very valuable list of what is more urgent on your desk at this point in time. Next slide, please. This directs you either to whatever you tick. Either you tick the annual safety report number, the blue one, then you come to the form of the submission that you did. Then you have to go to the assessment, or by ticking the request for information number, you directly go to the RFI itself. There are two options. You can respond in short words. By pushing the respond button, you activate a response field, a chat box where you can include short responses. And in addition to that, you can attach a document where you have to pick document type, because you could either update your SMPC or your investigator's brochure information that you submitted, or you give just information, detailed information on the question coming around. So whatever you are doing here, you have to select a type. There can be multiple rounds of question and answers, and as soon as we are satisfied, the member state, the SAMs, will finalize the assessment, and then you can see, next slide, please. Not the full assessment report, but you can see an extract, a result of the assessment. If we want you to do anything further, you will be pointed out via a little form, and you can also see when to do this. So when you go to the annual safety report tab, you filter for finalized assessments, and by going directly to the annual safety report number, you can see the outcome of the assessment. Next slide, please. And this is only a very short introduction into our end of the novelties, so to say. The implementing regulation gives us a framework for safety cooperation. It, for the first time, introduces legally binding timelines on our side. It introduces the concept of a safety assessing member state. Now officially, you know it already perhaps from previous guidance, unofficial guidance documents. The safety assessing member state is in charge of the surveillance for the whole substance. So the safety assessing member state will view, screen, and assess all SUSOs globally. He will assess all annual safety reports for all trials for a substance, only for EU trials. He will develop general recommendations in relation to safety concerns. Those recommendations go via the system to the RMS and member states concerned. The RMS and member states concerned take a look at their protocols. If indeed those recommendations apply to their trials, or perhaps the population affected by the potential safety issue is not included in their trials, then they have nothing to do. If they are affected, then they have to implement corrective measures if needed. The cooperation between SAMS and reporting member state concerns goes into two-directional communication. The SAMS recommends outcomes of safety assessment. The RMS member state concerned will implement it. If RMS receives an application for reference safety information change, he can consult the SAMS spec, who will feed back safety relevant information. So everything is interlinked, and we have already quite a good understanding of how to do this. The IT support, as I said, is not fully developed yet. It will be further developed. It will be fine. And CTFG is at this point in time already developing guidance, internal guidance, also reflecting our workarounds on our side, how to overcome the shortages in the T support. But I think it will be fine. So in the slides, in the background slides, I included a short summary of the clinical trial regulation, the safety relevant articles, and also a link to the Commission Q&A with my favorite answers to questions. But this is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we'll move to session 5, which is about guidance and training for SMEs and academia. And I will give the floor to Fia, who's going to provide us or give us an overview of the guidance and training available to sponsors and help you navigate all the training material and guidance documents that we have developed for implementing the regulation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Konstantinos. And indeed, I'm going to give you an overview of the guidance and training materials and also a little bit on how to find training events that we have available for sponsors. And I'm trying to speak to SME and academia in particular today. So we can skip slide 1 and go directly to slide 2. Thank you. So first of all, where do you start looking? We know that there is many documents, much training materials and other types of documents available, not only on the agency's website, the EMA's website, but also on other websites. So where to start looking? So I will walk you through this slide. And then in the very end of the presentation, I will give you a couple of tips of, well, how do you actually then in practice get started? So where do you start looking? So I would suggest the EMA's website, and we have a number of materials there. You'll find when you go and fetch this presentation from our website, you'll find the URL link there, but you can also, if you have your mobile phones right now, you can take the QR code and that will take you to the page. So on top of the slide here, we have the CTIS sponsor handbook, which indeed is a document that I'm going to give you a little bit more detail about, but that is a very good one to pick up. Contains summary information and links and references. The other online resource that you have is our training page. And we have a number of modules, not all those 20 are applicable to the sponsors, but we have both for authorities and sponsors on that page. So a little bit of that later as well. And then how do you find the events? That's been a question that we have received as well. Well, how do you know what events are going on and where to find those events? So on the EMA website, we have an events page, and there we will include, amongst other events, we will include the CTIS events as well. So you can have a look there, but also the training and support page that we have made available for you. That will also contain a link to training and information events that we are organizing. And finally, I'm going to highlight how do you get stay up to date with the developments and information and guidance on what steps to take when and where to look for information. CTIS highlights newsletters will be a very good source to use, and you can subscribe. So when you get hold of this slide, click yourselves through, because that contains also information how you subscribe to CTIS highlights newsletters. So we can move on to the next slide, which gives you a little bit more detail on the CTIS sponsor handbook. So that indeed is a very good starting point. We had the first version in July, and there will be a second version coming out just in the next few days. So keep an eye on our website. It does contain guidance in summary format and also links to various reference materials on key topics that really would be important for you. We have it on the EMA corporate website, and if you have at any point in time comments or you have proposals concerning the handbook, in the handbook itself there is a link to a survey where you can provide us with information. So just a few highlights on the type of topics that we have in the handbook. We can go to the next slide. How does the handbook really facilitate your preparations? It describes, again, what is CTIS, what does it do for you, how to register your users, when to register your users, how to register organizations. What about these administrators that we have been talking about today? Also, if you are in a situation that you would need to register a product, how do you do that? Then it also explains how to manage your users. So you have heard today about organization-centric, trial-centric approaches, preparers, submitters, viewers, a number of different roles. How do you manage those? It also gives you a summary and points you to information how to actually do that. Then it contains a section on transitional trials. So there was a lot of questions about that today. I saw that in the chat. And then about data, documentation, about processes, the safety reporting has been addressed. Also, what Laura was talking about, data transparency today, also been addressed. And then, again, support, where to find support, where to find the references. And here I wanted to highlight the Commission Q&A that is available. The latest versions is from September 2021. It will be a very central document to you as well, albeit it's quite extensive. But it does contain a number of responses to questions that we have seen coming through today also. So moving on to slide number 5, and there we have a catalog, and the font size indeed is very small, so it's probably best, if you want to really have a good look, pick up the slide and go back and have a look. These are all the modules of training that we have provided online. And I have highlighted here on this slide one in particular. We have created one online module that will be, we think it will be, very useful for SME and academia in particular, and that is Module 19. Just below Module 19 there on the slide, you can see there is a white one, Transition of Trials from UDRA-CT to CTIS. Now, this is all the white ones on this slide here, they are still in preparation, but there will be a module that explains how do you actually transfer then a trial in practice, really in practice, from UDRA-CT, so under directive, to CTIS under the regulation. And that module will be coming out before we go live. So keep an eye on the website, because that's where it will appear eventually. All the green ones we have already developed, they are available, and we are currently in the process of revising them. On slide number 6, then, you will have the different types of online materials that we are creating for each one of these green or white modules that you saw on the previous slide. So we don't do all of these, but we do selections of either frequently asked questions or quick guides or e-learning materials, audiovisual, that means demo clips. We also have instructor guides, which is more for master trainers and those who need to train colleagues in their organizations. There will be infographics, some additional support materials, depending a little bit on the module, and then there will be step-by-step guides as well. So those, if previously we provided quick guides, the step-by-step guide is actually a super quick guide. So that will probably be a very useful one to have a look at. On slide number 7, I would like to highlight to you the guide that we have developed. So if we can go to the slide number 7, thank you. And again, I've provided links in the slides. When you get access to the slides, you can click yourself through and go to the particular area in the document. So in the guide to CTIS training material catalog, you've seen this slide actually before today, but now what's been added is on the top, so the dark blue here is what does the sponsor do in the life cycle of a clinical trial application. And then on the bottom in slightly lighter is what does the authority do. So on the top row there, you have also indications of the different modules. So for instance, submission of a clinical trial application, the step that needs to be taken, you have module number 10 in the online training material catalog that will then help you to do that. But also, as I mentioned before, the SME Academia module is kind of a condensation of all the other modules that we have available. So will be a very useful one we're hoping for you to use. And that's how the cookie crumbles on this particular slide. So you have different steps of the application, and then you have a specific training module that is related to that particular step in the life cycle of a clinical trial. Now, then we move on to the next slide, and that actually then outlines the content of module 19, which we have developed together with representatives of SME and academia for this particular target group within our user community. So there we have a quick guide, which is a kind of introduction, but then you have a number of step-by-step guides that we think will be useful for you to pick up and understand what you need to do in what stage of the process. So they relate to users, to workload functionalities. There is a step-by-step guide for search, view, and download of data and information for your particular application. How to create and submit and withdraw a clinical trial application. It's in the center, a very central number 4 of the list of step-by-step guides, but of course it will be a very important one for you. And then we also have a particular one for RFIs, and we have step-by-step number 6, how to manage a clinical trial, and then the final one, how to submit an annual safety report. And then when it comes to other safety reporting, we are also looking at, and colleagues are looking at how to provide training and training materials for that, and that is in the making. So we can move on to slide number 9. And here I would just want to talk to you a little bit about the CTIS training environment and user support service. And the CTIS training environment being the one that sometimes we also call the CTIS sandbox. We understand it's a very important component of learning how to use CTIS. The purpose of the environment that we are making available is that it will enable those organizations and users that get access to it to explore, first and foremost, the user configuration and CTIS functionalities. For sponsors in particular, it will enable sponsors, so SME and academia sponsors equally, to create an application within the particular sponsor workspace of CTIS. Now, the CTIS training environment is at the moment a copy of the system as is, of CTIS itself, that is, and there is a possibility for a very limited interaction if necessary. We provide access in waves and in phases to these dedicated workspaces, and we do expect that those users who go into the CTIS training environment, that they are already trained on CTIS. That means that either you've done a very good job of using the materials that are available online and which will provide you with all the information that you need, but of course takes time to go through unless you use the SME Academia module, which then provides you a somewhat quicker path to understanding CTIS. Or some of you may be certainly for the larger companies and CROs, we've had a sponsor master trainer program that just finished, and they actually have just got access to the sandbox. So then what we are looking at the moment is there was a survey available, and I am speaking about that on the next slide as well. But before we go there, just about the user support service. There will be a very dedicated support desk available for the user community when we go live. But at the moment, the user support service that we have available is intended for those who are using the CTIS training environment. So again, how do you stay up to date with what's going on and where to get access and how to get access and so on? Please subscribe to the CTIS Highlights newsletter. That will be our very main channel of getting the information out to you so that you know when you can apply and how you can apply for the use of the CTIS training environment. And the access will be based on need. So if you need to use CTIS, then that's the answer to that. And then the urgency relates to when you intend to start submitting. So we can move on to the next slide, and I'll just very highlight in a few words what's important here, which is on the last bottom half of the slide. So the access in waves we talked about, and wave 3 being where sponsor organizations and users who don't have a master trainer would get access to the system. We had a self-assessment survey of need and urgency in October. It closed on the 31st of October. We are aware that some organizations were not in a position to provide the information and to put in their application and express their interest at that time. So once wave 3 has started on the basis of the October survey, then we may reopen the survey again so that others can then express their interest. And again, please have a look in the CTIS Highlights newsletter. That is the main channel for us for making the information available. However, now talking to SME and academia, we will also push out the information on the reopening of the survey through the SME database that we have, so those contacts that we have in the database, and also through our academia liaison database at the European Medicines Agency. And then on slide 11, you will have a collection of different links again, where to find different things, and most of those I've been speaking about today. Also, then you can find information on if you have a question, where can you go looking for the answer to that. So my last slide for today is slide number 12, and that is then getting to the practical steps. So how do you then prepare for the first use of CTIS? First of all, I'd like to highlight, use the sponsor handbook that we have made available. Then make use of the training module 19, which we have developed for SME and academia. Then if you go for the organization-centric approach, ensure then that the organization is registered in OMS as needed. Some of you might already be registered. Then the users of the organizations, those who intend to use CTIS, they must personally register also in EMA account management. Many of you will already have that account because you have been exposed to and used the services of the agency before. Then the sponsor administrator that Anna was speaking about earlier today for an organization-centric approach would also need to register. Then if you need to, you might also want to ensure that there is the product registered. There are other ways of registering products and organizations as well within CTIS, as was discussed before, but mainline register through the relevant portals that we have. Then prepare well, as Andrea, I think, was pointing out earlier today. Please do prepare well your clinical trial application, collect the supporting documents that you need in accordance with the clinical trial regulation requirements, and for that you will have the Commission draft Q&A that is available since September. Please make good use of that one also. And then keep yourself yourselves informed of the general developments on CTIS, and that is through the CTIS Highlights newsletter. Clicking yourselves through to the newsletter section, there we will find information also how to subscribe, which is basically through ct.communication@ema.europa.eu. That's an email address. Send just a simple email to say, subscribe me to newsletter, and we will do exactly so. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fia. And I realized I forgot to introduce you. So this was a presentation by Fia Westerholm, and she's the CTIS Program Assurance Manager and Change Management Lead on the project. And she's played a key role in the implementation of the regulation, and particularly for stakeholder engagement and communication. So thank you again, Fia. Just to a few points I would like to highlight. So we have received quite a lot of questions, so coming through Slido, and so the team behind the scenes have managed to summarize them and compile them and group them, and we just want to highlight that not all of them have been addressed during the actual event today, but we will take them into account to fine-tune, update all the guidance documents that we have in place. And so that was the first point that I wanted to highlight. One also correction. So all the presentations that you've seen today have been published on the EMA website already. They haven't been sent to you, so you can consult them. And I can see that some attendees are already going through them and sending us some suggestions on things to highlight, like hyperlinks. So we will do that immediately and update the documents. I think these are the 2 points I wanted to highlight before I give the floor to concluding remarks. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Konstantinos. So really helpful, information-rich morning on the clinical trials regulation and on Ctis. 2 months to go till go live. Time to get ready for everyone, not least here at the European Medicines Agency. So today we've heard from the European Commission on the clinical trials regulation and the changes that it brings. We've heard from sponsors on getting ready. We've heard from EMA on an introduction to Ctis, the Clinical Trials Information System. We've talked about the process for submitting a clinical trial application and reporting on safety. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all the colleagues that have presented and fielded questions today. I'd like to thank all of the colleagues who've organised this event, from the SME office here at EMA, but also the CTIS team within the European Medicines Agency. I'd also like to thank the product owners, both in the member states, but also in sponsor organisations who are collaborating, working, testing, advising us in the get ready for go live of the clinical trials regulation and Ctis. So thanks to all of you. And of course, finally, to thank all of you for engaging with our event today, for caring enough to spend your morning learning about the clinical trials regulation and Ctis. With that, I say one final thank you, and I say have a great end of day. All the best.